If you have ever spent time in the eastern part of the United States, then you know that the Appalachian mountain chain is completely different from any other wilderness on Earth. These mountains are not just old, they are ancient. They are older than the Atlantic Ocean. They are older than the rings of Saturn. They are older than the bones of the first dinosaurs that ever walked the planet. And over hundreds of millions of years of wind, rain, and deep, crushing isolation, the people who live tucked away in those hollows and ridges have developed a very specific set of unspoken rules. They tell you that if you are out in the woods after sundown and you hear someone calling your name from the dark, you never turn around. You keep walking. They tell you that if the forest suddenly goes dead silent and every bird and insect stops making noise, you do not try to investigate. You leave immediately. And above all else, there is one rule that every old-timer in those hills will look you dead in the eye and warn you about. If you are deep in the timber at night and you hear a whistle drifting through the trees, whatever you do, you never whistle back. In late October of 2021, a 28-year-old man named Logan Vance decided those rules were nothing more than campfire folklore meant to scare tourists. Logan was from Richmond, Virginia. He was an experienced outdoorsman, an avid trail runner, and a freelance landscape photographer who spent nearly every free weekend backcountry camping. He was fit, he was confident, and he carried top-of-the-line survival gear. On Thursday, October 21st, 2021, Logan packed up his charcoal gray Toyota Tacoma with cold weather gear, a heavy-duty single-man tent, high-calorie trail rations, and his expensive camera rig. He was heading towards Southwest Virginia, specifically aiming for the rugged, isolated wilderness surrounding Mount Rogers and the Lewis Fork backcountry. His plan was simple. He wanted to complete a 40-mile loop off the beaten path, away from the standard Appalachian Trail corridors where crowds gathered, specifically to capture long-exposure photographs of the autumn fog rolling through the dense pine canopies. Before hitting the trailhead on the morning of Friday, October 22nd, Logan stopped at a small, weathered general store off Route 58 near the town of Damascus to grab extra water purification tablets and a hot cup of black coffee. Behind the counter was an older man in faded denim overalls, cleaning a cast iron skillet. The man glanced out the window at Logan's packed truck, then looked back at Logan's high-tech trekking poles and GPS unit clipped to his chest harness. The man asked him where he was planning to set his boots down. Logan smiled, feeling that typical outdoor pride, and mentioned that he was cutting deep into the Lewis Fork drainage, heading toward an unmaintained ridgeline that local topographic maps called Pine Mountain Spur. The older man stopped wiping the skillet. He looked at Logan for several quiet seconds. Then, in a flat, very low voice, the man told him that the high timber back there was not a place to mess around in during late fall. The man told him that the weather turns on a dime, the hollows swallow cellular signals whole, and if he heard anything unusual echoing off the limestone bluffs after dark, he needed to keep his head down, mind his own business, and keep moving toward open ground. Logan laughed it off. He politely thanked the storekeeper, stepped back out into the chilly 50-degree morning air, and drove the remaining 12 miles up the winding gravel service road to the trailhead parking area. By 9 o'clock that morning, Logan was on the trail. The first day went entirely according to plan. The weather was crisp and clear. The autumn leaves were a brilliant canopy of fiery red, amber, and burnt orange. Logan hiked nearly 14 miles through rocky inclines, crossing small mountain creeks, and documenting every milestone on his handheld camera. By 5:30 in the afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the long, jagged spine of the mountains, dropping the temperature sharply into the low 40s. Logan found a small, flat clearing bordered by towering hemlock trees and a dense wall of wild mountain laurel. It was tucked against the side of a steep limestone ridge roughly 10 miles from the nearest maintained road. He set up his lightweight olive green tent, secured the guy lines against the rising mountain wind, and boiled water on his small camp stove for a freeze-dried meal. By 8:30 at night, pitch blackness had swallowed the forest. There was no moon. The canopy above was so thick that even the stars were blocked out, leaving only an oppressive, ink-black ceiling. Logan sat just outside his tent, wearing a thick fleece and a headlamp switched to a soft red light mode so as not to ruin his night vision. He was sipping hot tea, listening to the steady, comforting sounds of the night woods. Crickets chirping in the brush, the distant trickling of water, and the wind sighing through the upper boughs of the hemlocks. And then, right around 9:15, the sound simply vanished. It did not taper off. It did not fade away gradually. In a single, jarring split second, every cricket stopped. The wind died completely. The trickling creek seemed to disappear under a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of absolute stillness where you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your eardrums. Logan froze with his titanium mug halfway to his mouth. He listened intently, scanning the black wall of mountain laurel with the soft red glow of his headlamp. For 2 straight minutes, nothing moved. Then, drifting down from the ridge, roughly 70 yards up the slope, came a sound. It was a whistle. It was not a bird call. It was not the sharp, screeching chirp of an owl, nor was it the warble of a thrush. It was a clean, 2-tone human whistle. It went up in pitch on the first note and dropped sharply on the second note. It sounded vibrant, loud, and completely clear, as if someone were standing just beyond the tree line, whistling casually into the night air. Logan's immediate thought was not fear. His first instinct was that another hiker had gotten turned around in the dark, lost the trail, and was trying to signal for help. Without thinking twice, Logan sat upright, cupped his hands around his mouth, and whistled the exact same 2-tone pattern right back into the darkness. He waited. For 30 seconds, there was nothing. Logan was just about to shout out, asking if whoever was out there needed assistance, when the reply came. This time, the whistle did not come from 70 yards up the ridge. It came from barely 20 yards behind his tent, down inside the thick laurel patch. It was the exact same 2-tone whistle, but it was much louder, sharper, and delivered with a strange, forced intensity, like someone blowing air through their teeth with tremendous force. Logan instantly felt a cold chill run down the center of his spine. The terrain behind his tent was a steep, tangled drop-off, choked with thick briars and fallen timber. For a human being to move 50 yards through that dense brush in total darkness in under 30 seconds without making a single sound of snapping twigs or rustling leaves was physically impossible. Logan grabbed his tactical flashlight, clicked on the high-powered 2,000-lumen white beam, and swept it directly into the bushes. The bright light cut through the branches, illuminating the gnarled, twisting trunks of the mountain laurel. There was nothing there. No eyeshine, no clothing, no footprints. Logan stood on his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He yelled out, asking who was there and stating that he had a satellite communicator and was not looking for company. His voice echoed off the limestone ridge and died out into the black timber. There was no response. Nothing stirred. Logan did not sleep that night. He retreated inside his tent, pulled his heavy survival knife from his pack, and sat upright with his flashlight in hand until the first gray light of dawn crept through the nylon fabric at 6 in the morning. When daylight finally arrived, Logan felt a temporary wave of relief. In the cold morning mist, he told himself that exhaustion and mountain acoustics had simply played a trick on his mind. He convinced himself that the sound must have been an unusual bird or wind catching a hollow branch. He unzipped the tent and stepped outside onto the frozen, damp earth. He walked around to the back of his tent to inspect the perimeter, and that was when his blood turned to ice. Arranged in a clean, perfect semicircle, roughly 5 feet away from his tent pegs, were 4 small, deliberate piles of stones. Each pile contained exactly 6 flat pieces of slate, stacked neatly by size, with a fresh, wet clump of mountain moss placed on top of each stack. The ground surrounding the stone piles was soft mud, but there were no boot prints. There were no animal tracks. Just those 4 deliberate, silent markers. Logan did not bother making coffee. He did not bother properly folding his sleeping pad. He shoved everything into his pack with shaking hands strapped on his gear, and decided right then and there that his trip was over. He was going to turn around, trace the trail back to the main ridge, and get back to his truck. He pulled out his handheld GPS to confirm his heading, but when he looked down at the digital screen, the device was locked in a reboot loop. The screen would flicker on, show a distorted battery warning, and immediately shut down despite being fully charged the night before. Logan reached into his jacket for his smartphone, but the phone was completely dead. The cold had not drained it. The battery simply refused to hold power. Relying on his compass and his physical map, Logan started hiking back north along the trail. Except, the landscape around him did not look right. The path he had walked in on was a clear, narrow, single-track trail marked with faded yellow blazes on the tree trunks. But after walking for nearly 2 hours at a brisk, nervous pace, Logan realized he had not seen a single blaze on any tree. The trees around him seemed to grow closer together. The canopy was dense and gray, blocking the sun entirely, casting the forest floor in a strange, perpetual twilight. The air felt heavy, damp, and smelled strongly of rot and copper. By 2 in the afternoon on Saturday, October 23rd, Logan found himself walking in circles. Every hollow looked identical. Every rocky outcrop mirrored the last. The terrain seemed to fold in on itself, trapping him in a labyrinth of towering hemlocks and gray stone. Then, the fog began to roll in. It was not a light mountain mist. It was a thick, heavy, wall-like vapor that drifted down from the upper ridges, pooling in the hollows and reducing his visibility to less than 15 feet. As the daylight began to fade once again into the cold shadows of the Appalachian evening, Logan knew he had to find shelter. He could not navigate the steep ravines in total darkness. He found a shallow, natural overhang beneath a massive limestone shelf. He pulled his pack off, backed himself as far into the stone recess as he could go, and pulled his survival knife and his flashlight out. The woods went completely silent once again. Logan sat in the freezing dirt, his breath coming in shallow, trembling clouds of white vapor. At precisely 7:45 that evening, a sound broke through the fog. It was not a whistle this time. From somewhere high up in the branches of the hemlock trees, 20 feet above the forest floor, came the sound of a voice. The voice was rough, dry, and strained, like vocal cords that had never been used before, struggling to form human syllables. It called out a single phrase, repeating the exact words Logan had shouted into the dark the night before, mimicking his exact pitch and tone with terrifying accuracy. "Who is there? I have a satellite communicator." Logan stopped breathing. He did not move a single muscle. He tilted his head back slowly, staring up into the dense, foggy canopy above his rocky overhang. Through the shifting gray mist, he heard the heavy, deliberate snapping of thick wood up in the treetops, followed by the sound of something massive shifting its weight from branch to branch, descending toward the ground directly above his head. Logan pressed his back flat against the cold, damp limestone, praying that the solid rock would somehow swallow him whole. Every instinct he had built up over a decade of hiking told him to run, but his legs were frozen stiff with primal dread. The snapping branches above slowed down, replaced by a wet, deliberate scraping sound against the bark of the massive hemlock tree. It was directly over the shelf of his overhang. From the dense fog, about 10 feet up the trunk, a pale, elongated silhouette came into view. It was unnervingly tall, gaunt, and moved with a jagged, unnatural flexibility, using hands with unnervingly long fingers to grip the tree bark with effortless strength. It did not have the posture of a man, yet it wore the twisted caricature of human shape. Then it paused. Slowly, the creature craned its neck around the trunk, tilting its head at an impossible, sharp angle until its face was pointed straight down toward the dark recess where Logan sat. Logan could not make out fine facial features in the gloom, but he saw 2 wide, glassy eyes that caught the faint ambient light, reflecting a dull, sickening yellow hue. Its mouth hung slightly open, showing teeth that were sharp, uneven, and crowded tightly together in a pale jawline. The thing opened its mouth wider. A wet, rattling exhale hissed from its throat, followed by that same hollow, mimicking voice, pitched perfectly to imitate Logan's own vocal cords from the night before. "Who is there?" Logan snapped. The paralyzing shock broke under pure survival adrenaline. He lunged out from beneath the limestone shelf, ignoring his heavy backpack, holding only his high-powered flashlight and his fixed-blade knife. He clicked the flashlight on, aiming the blazing 2,000 lumen beam directly into the creature's face. A piercing, metallic screech tore through the hollow. The creature shielded its eyes with long, spindly limbs and jerked violently backward into the higher branches, thrashing the evergreen needles in blind fury. Logan did not look back. He sprinted downhill through the fog-choked timber, abandoning all trail etiquette and pathfinding logic. He threw himself over fallen logs, ripped through dense thickets of wild blackberry thorns, and slid down muddy embankments, relying purely on the force of gravity to pull him down the mountain. Behind him, the heavy thudding of something large moving through the canopy followed at a terrifying pace. Branches snapped, and every few seconds, that two-tone whistle ripped through the fog, bouncing from the trees to the left, then the right, playing a sickening game of cat and mouse. Logan kept his eyes fixed downward, following a rocky, dried-up creek bed. He knew that in Appalachia, water always leads down to civilization if you follow it far enough. His lungs burned with cold mountain air. His boots were soaked in mud and freezing water. Twigs slashed across his face, tearing his skin, but he refused to slow down. He could hear the creature descending closer to the ground, its heavy, uneven footfalls crushing dry leaves just 20 yards behind his heels. Just as his legs were about to buckle from sheer physical exhaustion, the dense wall of hemlocks suddenly gave way to an open dirt road. Logan burst out of the woods, stumbling onto the gravel path and crashing hard onto his knees. Through the mist, about 50 yards down the road, sat the unmistakable silhouette of a parked white pickup truck with its yellow parking lights glowing in the dark. Beside the tailgate stood a local hunter in a high-visibility orange vest, unloading gear into the truck bed. Hearing the violent crash from the brush, the hunter instantly reached into the bed, pulled out a 12-gauge shotgun, and leveled it toward the tree line, shouting for whoever was out there to step into the open. Logan scrambled to his feet, waving his arms frantically and screaming that he was human, begging the man not to shoot. The hunter took one look at Logan's torn clothing, bleeding face, and wild, terrified eyes, and instantly understood that something was terribly wrong. As Logan reached the tailgate, the sharp, two-tone whistle echoed one last time from the edge of the dark tree line, barely 10 feet inside the timber. The hunter did not ask questions. He did not look into the woods. He immediately fired a warning blast into the air, pumped the shotgun, shoved Logan hard into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and sped down the gravel road with tires spraying rock in every direction. Neither man spoke for the entire 40-minute drive down to the nearest paved highway. Logan Vance survived that night, but he was forever changed. When local search and rescue teams later went up to recover his vehicle from the trailhead parking lot, they found his truck unlocked, with the driver's side window completely smashed and the 4 small piles of stacked slate sitting neatly on top of the hood. Logan sold his outdoor gear, moved away from the mountains, and never set foot inside a forest again. And to this day, if you ever ask him about his time in the Appalachian backcountry, he will give you only one piece of advice. If you ever hear a whistle in those ancient hills, you run, you pray, and above all else, you never, ever whistle back. If you ever travel through the northern stretch of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Georgia, right around the southern terminus of the Appalachian Range, you quickly learn that the locals treat the high-elevation forests with a deep, quiet reverence. The woods there are dense, choked with ancient rhododendron thickets, massive tulip poplars, and tangled mountain laurels that have grown undisturbed for hundreds of years. The soil is rich and dark, And when the heavy mountain fog rolls in off the ridges, it can sit inside those deep hollows for days at a time, completely cutting off the forest floor from the rest of the world. The people who have spent their entire lives living in the shadow of Blood Mountain and the surrounding Chattahoochee National Forest will tell you that there are things living up in those ridges that do not belong to the modern world. They have old stories that go back generations, passed down from Cherokee legends to early Appalachian settlers and down to modern homesteaders. They have rules for surviving those woods. They tell you that if you find an old, rusted iron gate standing alone in the middle of nowhere with no fence attached to it, you do not walk through it. They tell you that if you suddenly smell wet dog and sweet rot on a crisp, dry autumn afternoon, you turn around immediately. But the most important warning of all, the one that every single mountain hunter and search and rescue veteran knows by heart, is what to do when you hear something calling out to you from above. They tell you that if you are walking through the timber and you hear a familiar human voice calling your name from the high canopy, you must never look up. You keep your eyes planted firmly on the ground, you do not speak, you do not answer, and you keep walking. Because in those mountains, the moment you look up and acknowledge what is watching you from the branches, you let it know that its mimicry worked. In early November of 2022, a 33-year-old heavy equipment mechanic and amateur bow hunter named Wyatt Cooper decided to take a 4-day solo hunting trip that would push those ancient rules to their absolute limit. Wyatt lived in Dahlonega, Georgia. He was a lifelong outdoorsman, broad-shouldered, completely self-reliant, and intimately familiar with the northern wilderness. He was not a tourist, and he was not someone who spooked easily. On the morning of Thursday, November 3rd, 2022, Wyatt loaded his olive green Chevrolet Silverado with his compound bow, cold weather camouflage gear, a sturdy canvas wall tent, and enough dry provisions to last through the weekend. His destination was an isolated backcountry sector near Coosa Bald, specifically a rugged, unmaintained drainage basin known locally as Blood River Cove. It was a steep, heavily wooded ravine surrounded on 3 sides by towering granite cliffs, completely cut off from the popular day hike loops of the Appalachian Trail. Before heading up the old logging roads, Wyatt stopped at a small bait, tackle, and taxidermy shop off Highway 19 to pick up extra scent killer spray and a local game tag. The shop was run by a man named Jesse Calhoun, an 80-year-old lifelong resident of Union County whose family had farmed those valleys since the late 1800s. Jesse stood behind the wooden counter, carefully filling out the paperwork. When Wyatt pointed on the map to the high drainage bowl beneath the western flank of Coosa Bald, Jesse stopped writing. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses, looked Wyatt straight in the eye, and told him that the high timber in Blood River Cove had been completely dead for 3 seasons. Jesse explained that the deer had stopped bedding in the upper laurel thickets, the turkey flocks had moved down to the valley pastures, and the mountain felt wrong. Jesse leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a gravelly, serious murmur. He told Wyatt that if he insisted on camping up in that hollow alone, he needed to keep his bow close, keep a bright lantern burning through the night, and if the wind died down and he heard someone calling out to him from the trees, he had to keep his eyes pinned to the dirt and walk straight out of the gorge. Wyatt smiled, shook the old man's hand, and promised to keep his wits about him. He assumed Jesse was just spinning the usual tall tales to keep flatlanders and hunters away from his family's favorite honey holes. By noon that day, Wyatt had reached the end of an abandoned Forest Service track. He parked his truck, locked the hubs, and shouldered his 80-pound pack. The hike into the cove was grueling. The trail disappeared almost immediately, forcing him to navigate through dense stands of hemlock, mountain laurel, and slippery granite scree. By 4 in the afternoon, Wyatt reached a small, natural terrace situated roughly 1,200 feet below the ridgeline. The spot was completely surrounded by towering, ancient tulip poplars and massive hemlocks whose upper branches formed a solid, interlocking canopy 70 feet in the air. Even in the middle of the afternoon, the light filtering down was dim. cast in a muted, greenish twilight. Wyatt set up his canvas tent, secured his equipment, and hung his food rations high on a bear wire about 50 yards downwind from his campsite. That first evening was entirely uneventful. The air was crisp, hovering around 38 degrees, and the mountains smelled of fallen oak leaves, damp earth, and pine resin. Wyatt built a small, controlled campfire, cooked a meal of venison, sausage, and beans, and went to sleep early to the familiar, comforting sounds of screech owls and tree frogs echoing across the hollow. The strange events began on the second day, Friday, November 4th. Wyatt woke up at 4:30 in the morning, long before sunrise. He sprayed his camouflage gear with scent-eliminating mist, grabbed his compound bow and climbing tree stand, and hiked about half a mile deeper into the timber toward a natural game trail that crossed a dry creek bed. He found a massive poplar tree overlooking the crossing, attached his climbing stand, and hauled himself 30 feet up into the lower limbs. He clipped his safety harness to the trunk, sat down in the dark, and waited for the morning light to break over the ridge. Around 7 in the morning, the sun finally crested the granite cliffs, sending pale shafts of golden light slicing through the dense mountain fog. Wyatt sat motionless for 3 straight hours, his eyes scanning the forest floor for movement. But as the morning wore on, Wyatt began to notice something deeply unsettling. There was no wildlife. None at all. He did not see a single white-tailed deer. He did not hear a single woodpecker tapping against the dead timber. There were no gray squirrels scuttling through the dry leaf litter. The entire hollow felt hollow, sterile, and completely devoid of animal life. It was as if every living creature in the drainage basin had cleared out days before he arrived. At 10:15 in the morning, the light breeze that had been blowing through the valley suddenly died away. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and unnatural. It was the kind of dead stillness that makes your ears ring, pressing against your eardrums like deep water. Sitting 30 feet up in his tree stand, Wyatt felt an immediate prickling sensation of being watched. He slowly reached for his binoculars, scanning the timber directly across the ravine. The leaves of the lower brush were completely still. Then, drifting down from the high canopy above him, came a sound that made his stomach drop. It was a voice. It was faint, raspy, and carried on a low draft of cold air, coming from the upper boughs of a massive white pine roughly 40 yards up the slope. The voice called out a name, clear and distinct. Wyatt. Wyatt froze, his breath hitched in his throat. He did not move a muscle. He listened intently, thinking he must have imagined it, or that another hunter had somehow wandered into the drainage and seen him sitting in his tree stand. For 2 minutes, nothing happened. The forest remained frozen in that suffocating, dead silence. Then, from the very same tree, the voice spoke again. But this time, it was louder, closer, and the pitch had shifted completely. It sounded exactly like his younger brother, Caleb, who lived 3 hours away in Macon, Georgia. It had Caleb's exact southern drawl, his specific pitch, and his relaxed, conversational rhythm. Wyatt. Hey man, look up here. Where are you at? Wyatt's entire body went cold. His hands gripped the metal frame of his tree stand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His first instinct was to turn his head upward, to look into the thick evergreen needles of the white pine and see who was playing a sick, twisted joke on him. But the moment he began to lift his chin, the warning from old Jesse Calhoun flashed through his mind with terrifying clarity. If you hear someone calling out to you from the trees, keep your eyes pinned to the dirt. Wyatt forced his chin back down against his chest. He kept his eyes locked on the leaf-strewn ground 30 feet below his tree stand. He unclipped his safety harness with trembling fingers. He did not use his climbing stand to descend slowly. Instead, he grabbed the trunk of the poplar with his gloved hands and boots, shimming down the rough bark as fast and as quietly as he possibly could. The moment his boots touched the forest floor, a heavy, violent snapping sound echoed from the high branches directly overhead. Something massive was moving through the treetops. It was not leaping from branch to branch like an animal. It was crawling along the heavy boughs, shifting hundreds of pounds of weight with an eerie, rhythmic smoothness that did not belong to any bear or mountain lion. Wyatt kept his head down, staring only at the roots and rocks in front of his boots. He gripped his compound bow tightly in his right hand and began walking at a fast, deliberate pace back toward his campsite. Behind him, 70 feet up in the canopy, the creature kept pace. Every time Wyatt took 3 steps, he heard the creak of bending wood above him. Twigs, bits of lichen, and loose pine cones rained down onto the shoulders of his camouflage jacket. The voice began calling out again, but now it was switching between different tones in the middle of sentences. It started in Caleb's voice, transitioned into an old high school friend's voice, and ended in the dry, raspy tone of an old man. Wyatt! Stop walking, Wyatt! Look up at the branches. Look at me! Wyatt! We are right here. The words were spoken with a mechanical, emotionless cadence, like a tape recorder playing back fragmented audio clips that had been pieced together to form rough sentences. Wyatt's heart pounded against his ribs with painful force. He refused to look up. He kept his eyes glued strictly to the path, watching every step, guiding himself by the memory of the landscape. He finally burst into his camp clearing. His canvas tent stood in the center of the small terrace, looking like a fragile island of safety in the middle of the suffocating wilderness. Wyatt ducked inside the tent, zipped the heavy canvas flap shut, and backed into the farthest corner, holding his bow nocked with a broadhead hunting arrow aimed directly at the tent entrance. Outside, the heavy footsteps in the canopy came to a dead stop. The woods outside went completely silent once again. Wyatt sat in the dim, shadowed interior of his tent, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The air inside the tent suddenly grew freezing cold, and a putrid, sickening smell began to seep through the canvas fabric. It smelled like ancient swamp water, burnt hair, and decaying copper. Then, from directly above the peaked roof of the canvas tent, barely 6 feet above Wyatt's head, a heavy weight settled onto the ridgepole. The thick wooden pole groaned under the immense strain, bending downward several inches. From just on the other side of the thin canvas fabric, right above where Wyatt was sitting, came a low, wet, rattling exhale, followed by a voice that spoke in Wyatt's own exact tone and cadence. "I know you can hear me, Wyatt? Look up at the ceiling." Wyatt held his breath until his chest burned. The center ridgepole of the tent bent lower under the crushing, concentrated weight, sagging so deeply that the taut canvas rested only inches above his forehead. Through the heavy green fabric, the outline of 4 long, segmented appendages became visible. They pressed down slowly into the canvas, showing jointed, spindle-like fingers tipped with jagged, hook-shaped contours that gripped the center beam with immense power. The entity shifted its weight slightly, causing the wooden frame to creak and groan. The sickening smell of stagnant marsh water and copper filled the enclosed space, thick enough to make Wyatt gag. Then, the whisper came through the roof again, vibrating the canvas fibers with Wyatt's own exact pitch. "Look up at me. Wyatt. You know, I am right here." Wyatt knew that if he stayed inside the tent, he was cornered. If that creature tore through the canvas, he would have nowhere to swing his bow, nowhere to maneuver, and no line of sight to fight back. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Wyatt refused to look up at the sagging ceiling. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the zipper seam at the base of the tent door. He lunged forward. With his left hand, he violently ripped the zipper upward. With his right hand, he raised his compound bow, stepped out into the damp mountain air, and rolled onto his side across the freezing leaf litter. He scrambled instantly to his feet, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the forest floor around him. He did not look at the tent roof. He did not look up into the hemlock branches. From the top of the canvas structure came a high, ear-splitting screech that sounded like tearing metal mixed with a human scream. A heavy crash echoed through the campsite as the tent collapsed entirely under the violent thrashing of whatever was perched on top of it. Wyatt turned toward the faint path leading downhill out of Blood River Cove and ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. He abandoned his camping gear, his heavy rucksack, and his extra provisions, clutching only his compound bow and a small emergency flashlight clipped to his belt. Above him, the creature gave chase through the high timber. The sound of shattering branches followed him step for step, moving 70 feet in the air across the canopy. It moved with horrifying speed, swinging through the limbs like an immense gaunt spider, tracking him along the steep ridges of the ravine. The voices rained down from the treetops in a dizzying, overlapping chorus. It called his name in his brother's voice, his father's voice, and the cracked voice of old Jesse Calhoun from the Valley store. Wyatt kept his chin pressed hard against his sternum. He navigated purely by the beam of his flashlight, bouncing off the wet rocks, mud, and roots 5 feet in front of his boots. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in agony, and wild blackberry briars tore through his hunting pants and slashed his skin, but he did not slow his pace for a single second. After what felt like hours of frantic running through the pitch-black woods, the rocky ravine floor flattened out. The dense hemlocks began to thin, replaced by smaller laurel thickets along the edge of the abandoned logging road. Wyatt burst out of the tree line and hit the gravel track, tumbling hard onto his knees and scraping his hands against the rough stone. He scrambled back to his feet, sprinted the final 50 yards to his parked Chevrolet Silverado, hit the key fob unlock, threw himself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. He locked the doors and started the engine, flooding the gravel road with blinding halogen high beams. From the dark tree line directly beside the driver's side door, a heavy thud shook the ground. Wyatt stared straight ahead through the windshield, his hands shaking violently on the steering wheel, forcing himself not to glance out the driver's side window into the shadows. A sharp, raspy tapping sound began on the glass beside his left ear. It was slow and rhythmic, the sound of a hard, bony finger knocking against the window pane. Then, from the other side of the glass, the voice whispered one final time in his own voice. "Just one look, Wyatt." Wyatt slammed his foot on the accelerator. The truck's tires spun violently in the loose gravel, catching traction and launching the vehicle down the winding mountain road at full speed. He drove without stopping all the way down Highway 19 until he reached the bright lights of Dahlonega, only pulling into the parking lot of a well-lit 24-hour gas station around midnight. When local authorities and forestry officers went up the following Monday to inspect Wyatt's abandoned campsite, they found the canvas tent completely shredded from the outside, ripped into dozens of narrow strips. The heavy wooden ridgepole had been snapped cleanly in half, and deep, unnatural gouges were carved into the bark of every poplar tree surrounding the clearing. Wyatt Cooper never went back up to Blood River Cove. He sold his hunting gear, stepped away from solo backcountry trips entirely, and now spends his autumns hunting strictly in the open pastures of the Georgia lowlands. And whenever someone in the northern counties mentions heading deep into the Appalachian timber alone, Wyatt gives them the exact same warning he was given years ago. If you are ever in those ancient woods and you hear a familiar voice calling your name from the high branches, you keep your head down, you keep moving, and you never look up into the trees. If you have ever driven through the high, jagged ridgelines of eastern Tennessee, right along the western border of the Unaka Range in Unicoi County, you know that there are places where civilization simply fades into the background. Once you leave the main interstate corridors and head up the narrow, winding hollows, the modern world feels very far away. The mountains there are steep, ancient, and densely covered in thick stands of white oak, pitch pine, and tangled rhododendron thickets that grow so tall and thick they block out the sky. In those remote mountain communities, people live by a very specific code of self-reliance. Homes are spaced miles apart, tucked behind steep gravel switchbacks and hidden behind thick curtains of timber. Emergency services in these rural counties are stretched thin. If you dial 911 from a cabin high up on an unmaintained mountain road, the dispatchers will be completely honest with you. The nearest deputy is likely 20, 30, or even 45 minutes away, navigating washed-out logging roads in total darkness. Because of that isolation, the dispatchers who work the late-night shifts at the rural county emergency centers are used to hearing strange things. They get calls about black bears tearing into screened porches, bobcats screaming in the brush like injured people, and nervous city folks who rented an off-grid cabin and got spooked by the wind rattling the tin roof. They know how to talk someone down. They know how to separate natural wildlife behavior from genuine danger. But every once in a long while, an emergency recording comes through the dispatch console that defies every standard protocol, leaving experienced law enforcement officers completely at a loss for words. In late January of 2021, an emergency call came into the Unicoi County 911 Communications Center that would become one of the most disturbing, unsolved incidents in the region's modern history. The caller was a 32-year-old remote software architect and technical writer named Garrett Cole. Garrett was originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. In late 2020, seeking peace, quiet, and complete isolation to finish writing a complex technical manual, Garrett signed a 6-month winter lease on a newly renovated 2-story timber cabin situated at the very end of an unpaved forestry access road known as Cold Branch Spur. The property was perched high on the southern shoulder of Flat Top Mountain, roughly 11 miles from the nearest small town of Irwin. It was completely off the beaten path. The cabin sat on a 4-acre cleared terrace surrounded on 3 sides by dense national forest timber, with a sheer, rocky drop-off on the 4th side overlooking a deep, uninhabited ravine. The property had its own backup propane generator, a deep well water pump, a wood-burning stove, and a satellite internet dish mounted to the roof to provide broadband connectivity. On the evening of Thursday, January 28, 2021, a severe winter storm began pushing across the southern Appalachians. The National Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning for the high elevations, predicting heavy freezing rain, dense freezing fog, and several inches of accumulation by morning. The temperature on the mountain was dropping rapidly, hovering around 22 degrees, and the wind was howling through the upper pine boughs, shaking the heavy timber walls of the cabin. Garrett was sitting at his kitchen table, wearing a thick wool sweater, sipping black coffee, and working on his laptop by the warm orange glow of the wood-burning stove. Outside, the freezing rain was coming down hard, coating the spruce branches and the tin roof of the cabin in a thick, crystalline layer of heavy ice. Around 9:45 that evening, the cabin lights flickered twice and went out. The main electrical power grid had failed down in the valley. A few seconds later, the automatic propane generator out back kicked on with a low, steady mechanical hum, restoring power to the interior lights and the refrigerator. Garrett saved his work, closed his laptop, and decided to call it an early night. He walked around the ground floor, checking the heavy deadbolts on the front oak door and the sliding glass patio doors that led out onto the raised rear wooden deck. Everything was secure. Around 10:15, Garrett climbed the wooden staircase to the second-floor master bedroom, turned on a small space heater, and fell asleep to the rhythmic tapping of freezing rain against the double-paned glass windows. At precisely 1:24 in the morning, Garrett was abruptly jolted awake. It was not the sound of the wind or the hum of the generator. It was a sharp, loud, rhythmic pounding on the heavy wood of the front door downstairs. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was heavy, deliberate, and forceful enough to vibrate the wooden floorboards beneath Garrett's bed. Garrett sat up instantly in the dark, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the digital alarm clock on his nightstand, 1:25 in the morning. His first thought was that a local driver or a utility worker had slid off the icy mountain switchbacks and hiked through the freezing rain to find help. Garrett climbed out of bed, pulled on a heavy fleece jacket, grabbed his high-powered tactical flashlight, and walked out onto the second-floor landing. He leaned over the wooden railing, shining the light down into the dark living room toward the front entryway. The pounding stopped. Garrett called out in a loud, firm voice asking who was at the door and stating that he was armed and awake. His voice echoed through the empty vaulted living room. There was no verbal response from the other side of the door. Garrett waited for nearly a minute, listening intently. The only sound was the howling wind and the steady drone of the propane generator outside. He took 3 steps down the staircase, holding the flashlight ready, intending to look through the peephole to see if an injured person was collapsed on the front porch. Before his boots could touch the 5th step, the sound shifted. It did not come from the front door anymore. From the rear of the house, out on the 2nd-story wooden deck that wrapped around the master bedroom, came the sound of footsteps. They were not the light, rapid scurrying of a raccoon or an opossum. They were heavy, deliberate, 2-legged footsteps, crunching slowly across the thick crust of ice covering the wooden deck boards. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Garrett froze on the stairs. His blood ran cold. The rear deck was elevated 18 feet off the ground, built over the steep drop-off of the ravine. There was no exterior staircase leading up to that deck. The only way to access it from the outside was to scale 18 feet of smooth, ice-covered support posts or to drop down from the high roofline of the cabin. Garrett scrambled back up the stairs into the master bedroom. He closed the bedroom door, locked the interior latch, and pulled his cell phone from the nightstand. He checked the screen. Because the cellular towers down in the valley were overwhelmed by the ice storm, the phone showed no standard cellular bars, but it was connected to the cabin's satellite internet network via voice-over Wi-Fi. At 1:28 in the morning, Garrett dialed 911. The call was routed to the Unicoi County Emergency Dispatch Center in Irwin, where a veteran night dispatcher named Marcus Webb answered the line. The official audio recording of that emergency call, which would later be preserved in county archives, began with Garrett speaking in a fast, breathless, trembling whisper. Garrett told the dispatcher that someone was on his property at the end of Cold Branch Spur. He stated that someone had pounded violently on the front door, and now someone was pacing across the 2nd-floor rear deck right outside his bedroom window. Dispatcher Marcus Webb was calm and professional. He verified Garrett's address, checked the regional patrol map, and told Garrett that a sheriff's deputy was being dispatched immediately, but warned him that due to the severe ice storm and fallen trees across the mountain roads, the estimated arrival time would be at least 35 to 40 minutes. Marcus instructed Garrett to stay in the locked room, keep the lights off, stay away from the windows, and find an object to use for self-defense. Garrett walked quietly across the bedroom, picked up a heavy steel fireplace poker that was leaning against the small bedroom hearth, and crouched down between the bed and the interior wall, keeping his phone pressed tightly to his ear. On the 911 recording, the sound of the howling wind outside can be heard clearly in the background. Then, around the 4-minute mark of the call, the sound of the footsteps on the deck suddenly stopped. Garrett whispered into the phone, telling the dispatcher that the footsteps had halted directly in front of the large, double-paned sliding glass door that opened out onto the balcony. Marcus told Garrett to remain silent and not to make any sudden movements. For 30 seconds on the recording, there is complete silence, save for Garrett's ragged, shallow breathing. Then, a new sound came through the phone line. It was a slow, wet, rhythmic scraping sound against the glass of the sliding door. It sounded like hard, sharp fingernails dragging slowly down the exterior surface of the frozen glass, carving thin lines through the ice. Garrett began to panic on the line. He whispered frantically to the dispatcher, saying that the blinds were closed, but he could see a dark, massive silhouette pressing against the glass from the outside, blotting out the ambient light of the snow. Marcus tried to keep Garrett calm, telling him that the deputy was 5 miles away, navigating the lower switchbacks with tire chains. At the 7-minute mark of the recording, the scratching on the glass abruptly ceased. And then, coming from the other side of the glass door, right on the wooden deck, a voice spoke. The audio captured on the 911 recording was low, raspy, and deeply distorted, but the words were unmistakable. It called out Garrett's full legal name, pronouncing the syllables with a dry, mechanical rhythm, as if reading them from a formal document. Garrett, Thomas, Cole. Garrett choked back a sob on the recording, asking the dispatcher how whoever was outside could possibly know his middle name. He had never met anyone in the county. He had moved into the cabin under a private corporate lease only 2 months prior. Marcus asked Garrett if he had left any mail, vehicle registrations, or packages on the front porch or in an unlocked vehicle. Before Garrett could answer, the voice outside the glass spoke a second time. This time, the voice did not sound low and raspy. The pitch shifted completely, turning into a high, trembling, feminine voice. On the recording, the voice spoke with terrifying clarity, mimicking the exact words and cadence that Garrett's own mother had used during a phone conversation earlier that afternoon. "Garrett, sweetheart, it is so cold out here. Please unlock the door and let me in." Garrett lost all composure. He began hyperventilating into the phone, crying and telling the dispatcher that his mother was 600 miles away in Florida and that whatever was standing on the second-story deck was not human. Marcus stayed on the line, his voice firm and commanding, ordering Garrett not to move toward the door, repeating that the deputy was now 3 miles away, turning onto Cold Branch Spur. At the 11-minute mark of the 911 call, the exterior propane generator in the backyard suddenly shut off. The cabin went pitch black. The hum of the space heater died, plunging the bedroom into freezing, silent darkness. On the phone line, the background hum of the Wi-Fi router dropped. The call began to break up with heavy digital static. Through the static, Garrett's terrified voice came through one last time. "The glass. It is leaning against the glass. The frame is bending." Then, a loud, violent sound of wood splintering and tempered glass cracking echoed through the phone receiver, followed by a heavy, wet thump on the hardwood floor inside the master bedroom. The phone line went completely dead. At 2:12 in the morning, 38 minutes after the line went dead, Unicoi County Sheriff's Deputy Brian Hensley finally arrived at the property on Cold Branch Spur. His four-wheel drive patrol vehicle had to push through fallen pine boughs and several inches of slick, packed sleet to reach the clearing. When he pulled into the gravel drive, his headlights illuminated the dark, imposing silhouette of the timber cabin. The backup generator was completely dead. The entire property sat in total, freezing darkness. Deputy Hensley unholstered his department-issued Glock, clicked on his high-powered tactical flashlight, and approached the front porch. The front oak door was locked tight, showing no signs of forced entry. The windows on the ground floor were completely intact, frosted over with thick sheets of winter ice. Hensley walked around the perimeter of the cabin, his boots crunching through the fresh snow and sleet. When he reached the rear of the house, he aimed his flashlight beam up at the elevated second-story deck. The massive, double-paned, sliding glass door leading into the master bedroom had not been shattered outward onto the deck, it had been caved inward into the room. Heavy shards of tempered safety glass littered the interior floor, and the aluminum framing was warped and twisted, bent under massive localized pressure. Hensley called for immediate county backup, kicked open the ground floor rear access door, and cleared the house room by room. The ground floor was orderly. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to cold gray ash. Garrett's laptop sat open on the kitchen table, running on its final reserve battery, showing an unfinished document. Hensley climbed the wooden stairs to the master bedroom. The room was freezing, the howling winter wind blowing freezing rain straight through the gaping hole where the sliding door had stood. The interior of the bedroom was in complete disarray. The heavy patchwork quilt was ripped from the mattress, and the steel fireplace poker Garrett had picked up was lying on the floor, bent almost completely in half at a 45-degree angle. Garrett Cole was nowhere to be found. His cell phone lay on the floor near the nightstand, its screen shattered and the battery dead. When state forensic investigators and tracking teams arrived at daybreak, they discovered physical evidence that left seasoned law enforcement officers utterly bewildered. On the ice-covered floorboards of the second-story balcony, where the temperature had hovered around 20 degrees all night, there were clear, distinct footprints. They were not boot prints, nor were they the tracks of a bear or mountain lion. They were bare, elongated, human-like footprints measuring nearly 16 inches in length, featuring 6 distinct clawed toes that had pressed straight through the solid glaze of ice into the wood below. The tracks led to the edge of the 18-foot wooden balcony railing. And from the top rail of that deck, the tracks simply ended. There were no jump marks in the snow on the ground 18 feet below. There were no drag marks leading down into the steep ravine. The tracks stopped at the outer edge of the railing, as if whatever made them had simply lifted off into the freezing fog and vanished into the upper tree canopy. A massive 4-day search and rescue operation was launched across Flat Top Mountain, utilizing infrared-equipped state police helicopters, scent tracking hounds, and over 40 mountain rescue volunteers. The search dogs refused to work the perimeter beneath the rear balcony. The moment the handlers brought the hounds near the shattered glass of the master bedroom, the animals began whining, trembling violently, and pulling backward on their leads, refusing to cross the threshold into the room. Not a single shred of Garrett Cole's clothing, personal effects, or physical remains was ever found in the Unicoi County backcountry. The case was officially classified as an open missing persons investigation under suspicious circumstances, but the audio recording of the 11-minute 911 call was placed under a permanent administrative seal by the county district attorney's office. The cabin on Cold Branch Spur remained vacant for 2 years before the owner eventually sold the property to a private timber investment firm, which had the entire 2-story structure torn down and bulldozed into the earth. To this day, if you ask the older deputies and emergency dispatchers in Irwin about the winter storm of January 2021, they will politely change the subject, because everyone in that dispatch room heard the tape. They heard the voice outside the glass. And they know that in those ancient, frozen Appalachian hollows, there are things waiting in the dark that know your name, know your voice, and are only waiting for you to answer the door. If you have ever driven along the Blue Ridge Parkway in the western corner of North Carolina, winding through the high mountain elevations between Asheville and Boone, you know just how breathtaking that landscape really is. You have those sweeping overlooks, rolling blue-tinted ridges that stretch out as far as the eye can see, and deep valleys blanketed in dense forests of rhododendron, Fraser fir, and ancient hemlocks. Millions of tourists visit every single year, bringing their families to hike the scenic loops, take photographs of the waterfalls, and camp out under the stars. Because the Parkway is one of the most heavily visited scenic corridors in the entire federal park system, the United States National Park Service works very hard to maintain an image of safety, serenity, and orderly management. If a hiker twists an ankle, search and rescue goes out and brings them back. If a black bear gets too comfortable around picnic sites, wildlife specialists relocate the animal deep into the wilderness. Everything is documented, categorized, logged into official federal databases, and summarized for public safety reports. However, if you ever sit down with one of the veteran law enforcement rangers who spent 30 years patrolling those isolated backcountry sectors off the main paved corridors, they will tell you that there are certain incidents that never make it into the official public logs. There are files that get assigned special administrative codes marked as inconclusive and quietly locked away in regional headquarters vaults. And in the spring of 2016, along an extremely rugged and isolated section of the Grandfather Mountain backcountry, one specific law enforcement ranger was handed a case so baffling and so deeply disturbing that his superiors ordered him to wipe his field notes, destroy his physical photos, and never speak a single word about it to the press. That ranger was a 41-year-old supervisory law enforcement ranger named Clayton Vance. Clayton was not an inexperienced rookie. He had served 6 years as a military police officer in the United States Army before joining the National Park Service in the early 2000s. He had worked remote search and rescue details in Yosemite, the high desert of Big Bend, and for the previous 9 years, He had been stationed along the Pisgah district of the Blue Ridge Parkway. He was methodical, disciplined, highly trained in wilderness forensics, and carried a department-issued Glock 21-45 caliber sidearm alongside heavy tracking gear. On the morning of Tuesday, May 17, 2016, Clayton arrived at the Linville Falls Ranger Outpost just before 7 o'clock. The morning was unusually cold and gray for late spring, with a heavy, clinging mountain fog hanging low across the ridges, reducing visibility to less than 30 yards. As Clayton poured his first cup of coffee, his regional dispatch radio crackled to life on the secure administrative channel. It was the district chief ranger from the Asheville headquarters instructing Clayton to immediately drive out to an unmaintained logging turnout near the base of an isolated geographic formation known as Lost Cove Gorge. The call was not a standard missing person report. According to dispatch, a private timber surveyor working the National Forest boundary line had spotted a late-model four-wheel drive SUV parked at the end of an overgrown, gated service road off milepost 310. The vehicle had not moved in 4 days. The windows were down, the driver's side door was swung wide open, and high-value gear was visible inside the cab, completely exposed to the elements. Clayton grabbed his tactical duty bag, heavy canvas field coat, a forensic evidence kit, and walked out to his green and white Park Service Ford F-254 wheel-drive patrol truck. The drive took nearly 45 minutes, winding through narrow, washed-out gravel tracks that climbed into the deep, unpatrolled gaps between the ridges. The vegetation along the road grew thicker with every mile, the rhododendron canopies locking together overhead to form a dark, continuous tunnel of green leaves that blocked out the morning sky. Around 8:15, Clayton reached the gated logging spur. Sitting in the muddy gravel turnaround, surrounded by towering red spruce trees, was a dark gray 2014 Jeep Grand Cherokee bearing Virginia license plates. Clayton stepped out of his truck into the freezing mountain mist. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic dripping of water falling from the spruce needles onto the forest floor. The air smelled strongly of wet loam, decaying leaves, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold river stone. Clayton approached the abandoned Jeep with his hand resting near his duty holster. The vehicle was registered to a 35-year-old commercial architectural photographer from Charlottesville, Virginia, named Arthur Bennett. Clayton looked through the open driver's side door. The keys were still resting in the ignition switch, turned to the accessory position, which had long since drained the vehicle's battery. On the passenger seat sat Arthur's leather wallet containing his driver's license, $600 in cash, his credit cards, and an expensive smartphone that was completely dead. In the back seat were 2 Pelican hard cases containing over $10,000 worth of specialized medium-format digital camera bodies and prime lenses, completely untouched. There were no signs of a robbery, there were no signs of a physical struggle or broken glass. Clayton walked around to the rear of the Jeep and looked at the muddy ground. In the soft clay near the rear bumper, there was a single set of fresh, lug-soled hiking boot prints heading off the gravel track, leading straight into the dense, trailless timber of Lost Cove Gorge. Lost Cove Gorge was an infamous piece of terrain. It was an exceptionally steep, narrow ravine flanked by sheer limestone bluffs on one side and a roaring mountain torrent on the other. It was not a designated recreational trail. It was a wild, unmanaged drainage choked with massive fallen hemlocks, loose shale slides, and deep vertical crevices that dropped dozens of feet into the limestone bedrock. Clayton keyed his shoulder microphone, checking in with regional dispatch. He logged the Jeep's identification numbers, established a command log, and stated that he was initiating a solo, hasty search along the fresh boot trail into the gorge. At 8:45 in the morning, Clayton unlatched the heavy wooden gate, racked around into his sidearm, and stepped off the logging road into the deep forest. Tracking Arthur Bennett's boot prints was surprisingly easy at first. The ground was soft from days of spring rain, and the hiker had made no attempt to conceal his direction. The tracks cut a straight line through the rhododendron thickets, heading downward toward the rocky floor of the ravine. Clayton moved at a steady, cautious pace, his eyes scanning the dense timber ahead. After descending roughly 600 feet into the gorge, Clayton noticed the first anomaly. The boot prints in the mud began to change their pattern. The stride, which had been a normal, measured 30-inch walking step, suddenly doubled to over 5 feet. The toe marks were pressed deeply into the clay, while the heel marks were barely visible, indicating that Arthur Bennett had suddenly broken into a dead, frantic sprint through the dense brush. Clayton followed the running tracks down toward a flat, rocky terrace situated beside the rushing waters of the creek. As he stepped out onto the terrace, Clayton found Arthur's high-end handheld satellite GPS communicator lying in the wet moss. The device was undamaged, but when Clayton picked it up and inspected the casing, he saw that the heavy-duty nylon lanyard had not snapped or torn. It had been sliced cleanly through, as if severed by an impossibly sharp edge. Clayton bagged the GPS unit, marked the coordinates in his notebook, and continued following the running boot prints along the base of a towering 60-foot limestone bluff that formed the northern wall of the gorge. Around 10:30 in the morning, the boot tracks led directly into a narrow, vertical fissure in the solid limestone wall. The crack in the rock was barely 3 feet wide and stretched back into the dark interior of the mountain. A steady, freezing draft of air blew outward from the stone opening, carrying a strange, heavy odor that made Clayton's skin prickle. It was not the natural, earthy scent of a cave. It was a putrid, sickening combination of burnt hair, ozone, and old copper. Clayton pulled his high-powered tactical searchlight from his belt, turned on the 2,000-lumen beam, and stepped inside the fissure. The passage was narrow, forcing him to turn his shoulders sideways as he navigated the jagged rock walls. The floor of the fissure was dry, composed of fine limestone dust and crushed shale. After walking 15 yards into the stone crevice, the passage opened up into a small, natural subterranean chamber roughly 20 feet across. Clayton swept his searchlight across the room. Resting against the far wall of the chamber was Arthur Bennett's heavy canvas rucksack. Beside the pack lay his heavy titanium trekking poles, his water filter, and his spare fleece jacket, all laid out on the flat stone in a neat, symmetrical line. And sitting on top of the fleece jacket was Arthur's handheld digital audio voice recorder. Clayton knelt down on the cold limestone floor, his pulse quickening in his throat. He put on a pair of blue nitrile forensic gloves, picked up the small silver recorder, and looked at the digital display. The device had battery power remaining. The display indicated that a single 42-minute audio file had been recorded on the morning of Friday, May 13th, 4 days prior. Clayton brought the small speaker close to his ear, pressed the play button, and listened. The recording began with the heavy, frantic sound of Arthur Bennett breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. In the background of the audio, the wind howling through the spruce trees outside the rock fissure could be heard clearly. Arthur was whispering into the microphone, his voice trembling with sheer, unbridled terror. He was explaining that he had been setting up a wide-angle landscape shot near the creek when the forest had suddenly gone completely silent. He said that he had heard someone calling his name from the upper tree canopy using his father's voice. On the recording, Arthur explained that he had tried to hike back to his Jeep, but every time he tried to climb the ridge, the terrain seemed to shift, leading him in circles back to the creek bed. Then, around the 20-minute mark of the audio file, Arthur went completely silent. Through the small speaker of the recorder, a new sound became audible in the background. It was a slow, wet, scraping sound on the solid stone walls of the outer fissure. Something was squeezing its way through the narrow 3-foot passage from the outside forest, dragging heavy, leathery limbs across the limestone rock. On the tape, Arthur began to weep softly, whispering a prayer over and over under his breath. Then, breaking through the darkness of the subterranean chamber, a voice spoke on the recording. The voice was not coming from Arthur. It was low, raspy, and pitched with a sickening mechanical perfection, speaking in Arthur's own exact tone and cadence, mimicking the words Arthur had spoken just minutes earlier. "Please, I just want to go back to my truck. Please let me go." On the recording, a sudden, violent scuffle broke out. There was the sound of heavy stone shifting, a brief, suffocating gasp of agony from Arthur, followed by the sharp, metallic click of something tapping rhythmically against the microphone casing. And then, right before the audio file terminated at the 42-minute mark, the recording captured a sound that caused Clayton's breath to lock solid in his chest. From the dark interior of the cave, the voice on the tape spoke one final sentence, but this time, it was not using Arthur Bennett's voice. It spoke in the deep, authoritative voice of Supervisory Ranger Clayton Vance himself, using his exact radio call sign, "Ranger Vance, Unit 412. We have been waiting for you in the gorge." Clayton lowered the recorder with shaking hands. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. The air inside the small chamber felt icy cold, dropping well below freezing in a matter of seconds. And then, from the narrow, 3-foot stone fissure behind him, the only exit leading back to the daylight of the Blue Ridge Forest, came the slow, wet sound of something dragging itself across the rock toward the chamber. Clayton did not freeze. A decade of military police training and high-stress backcountry rescues overrode the icy dread clawing at his chest. He dropped the audio recorder into his tactical vest pocket, drew his Glock 45 caliber with his right hand, and raised his high-powered searchlight with his left, locking his stance toward the narrow fissure entrance. The scraping sound against the stone grew louder, accompanied by a low, rhythmic rattle of wet lungs. Slowly, dragging its body through the 3-foot vertical crack in the limestone, the creature entered the beam of light. It was nearly 8 feet in length, emaciated, and moved with a sickening, double-jointed crawl that allowed its skeletal frame to compress and slide through spaces no human could ever navigate. Its skin was mottled gray, slick with stagnant cave moisture, and completely hairless. Its long, spindly limbs ended in splayed, 6-fingered hands tipped with thick, dark claws that gouged deep grooves into the solid rock floor. Its head craned upward into the blinding glare of the 2,000-lumen searchlight. The creature had no nose, no visible ears, only a smooth expanse of pale, rubbery flesh where eyes should have been. But beneath that blank skull was a wide, jagged maw filled with crowded rows of needle-like teeth. The creature tilted its face toward Clayton, opened its jaw impossibly wide, and spoke in Clayton's own exact voice, matching his radio dispatch cadence. "Officer in need of assistance. Unit 412. Shots fired." Clayton fired. 3 deafening blasts from his 45 caliber pistol echoed through the enclosed limestone chamber, muzzle flashes illuminating the cave in blinding strobe-like bursts. The heavy hollow-point rounds struck the creature dead center in the chest and shoulder. The entity let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek that rattled the loose shale off the ceiling. Black, tar-like fluid sprayed from the entry wounds, but the impacts barely staggered its forward momentum. It thrashed violently, its long limbs snapping outward, swiping the tactical flashlight straight out of Clayton's grip. The light crashed against the rock wall, spinning across the floor and casting chaotic, shifting shadows across the ceiling. Clayton lunged forward in the dim light. Instead of retreating deeper into the dead-end chamber, he drove his entire body weight into the creature, using his tactical boot to stomp down with all his strength onto one of its splayed, clawed wrists. The creature hissed, its jaw snapping inches from Clayton's face, filling the air with the suffocating stench of rotting copper and sulfur. Clayton used the split second of disorientation to wrench himself free, diving headfirst into the narrow stone fissure. He scrambled on his stomach through the jagged passage, ignoring the sharp limestone tearing through his uniform and slicing into his forearms. Behind him, the creature turned and pursued, its claws screeching against the rock as it squeezed into the crack right behind his boots. Clayton burst out of the cliff face and into the cold mountain air of Lost Cove Gorge. He did not look back. He sprinted along the rocky creek bed, bounding over slick boulders and pushing through the dense rhododendron thickets with reckless abandon. Behind him, from the high canopy 60 feet above the ravine floor, came the violent cracking of massive hemlock boughs as the entity climbed and tracked him from the trees, matching his desperate sprint step for step. Clayton reached the steep 600-foot incline leading out of the gorge. His lungs burned, his uniform was soaked in sweat, mud, and blood, but he drove his boots into the soft clay, scrambling up the mountain on hands and knees until he finally broke through the final brush line onto the gravel logging spur. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his patrol truck, slammed the door, and locked the cab. With shaking hands, he jammed the key into the ignition, threw the heavy truck into four-wheel drive, and sped down the washed-out mountain road, the tires throwing shale and mud as the vehicle slid around the blind switchbacks. When Clayton arrived back at the Linville Falls Ranger Station an hour later, he immediately locked himself in the administrative office, uploaded the digital audio recording to the secure regional server, and filed a comprehensive 15-page incident report detailing the encounter, the abandoned vehicle, and the recovery of Arthur Bennett's gear. At 6 o'clock that evening, two high-ranking officials from the regional headquarters in Asheville arrived at the station in an unmarked black government SUV. They did not ask Clayton about his physical injuries. They did not debrief him on search and rescue procedures. Instead, they confiscated Clayton's field notes, wiped the local workstation hard drives, and deleted the audio file from the regional server right in front of his eyes. The senior official placed a typed federal non-disclosure document on the desk, looked Clayton in the eye, and told him that Arthur Bennett was officially being classified as a missing person presumed deceased due to an accidental fall in rugged terrain. Clayton was told in no uncertain terms that if he ever mentioned the audio tape, the cave, or what he had seen in Lost Cove Gorge to the media, his pension would be revoked, his law enforcement credentials stripped, and he would face immediate federal prosecution under national security directives. 2 weeks later, Clayton Vance submitted his formal resignation from the United States National Park Service. He packed his belongings, sold his home in western North Carolina, and moved across the country to the open, flat plains of Montana. The official public registry still lists Arthur Bennett as an unresolved disappearance on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The gated access track leading into Lost Cove Gorge was permanently closed by the Park Service later that summer, blocked off by massive concrete barriers and marked with high-voltage warning signs citing unstable geological fault lines. Clayton Vance never returned to the Appalachian Mountains. And whenever young park rangers or wilderness enthusiasts ask him why an experienced veteran with an unblemished record suddenly walked away from his career, Clayton gives them only one piece of advice. The Park Service knows what is living in those ancient, deep hollows. And if you ever find a case that leads into the dark under those mountains, you bury it, you walk away, and you pray it never learns your name. In early September of 2021, a 34-year-old museum conservator named Darren Kelly purchased a property that felt like the realization of a lifelong dream. Darren had spent more than a decade working in Boston, living in small, overpriced brick apartments where space was at an absolute premium. His specialty was the physical restoration of antique furniture and historical woodwork, a craft that required dedicated square footage, excellent natural lighting, and total quiet. After saving diligently for years, Darren began searching throughout the historic towns of New England for an older home with authentic colonial architecture that had not been butchered by modern open-concept renovations. He found a listing for an expansive, two-story saltbox colonial home located on the wooded outskirts of Greenfield, Massachusetts. The house had originally been erected in 1788, sitting quietly at the end of an unpaved lane off Silver Street, surrounded by 3 acres of dense sugar maples and ancient stone walls. It had remained in the possession of a single reclusive family for over 4 generations before finally being transferred to a bank trust following the death of its last elderly occupant in late 2019. Because the property required significant cosmetic work, including plaster restoration, rewiring, and extensive carpentry repairs, the purchase price was exceptionally reasonable. Darren closed on the sale on September 18th, loaded his specialized woodshop tools, clamps, and personal belongings into a 20-foot box truck and made the drive west into Franklin County. During the first few weeks of autumn, the Greenfield house seemed ideal. The ground floor featured wide plank pumpkin pine floors, heavy hand-hewn ceiling beams, 2 massive central brick fireplaces, a formal parlor, a dining room, and an expansive rear addition that Darren immediately claimed as his primary furniture conservation workshop. The upper level contained 2 large corner bedrooms, a single bathroom fitted with vintage plumbing, and an open landing that looked down over the front foyer. The house was cold, smelling intensely of dry lath plaster, old beeswax, and centuries of wood ash trapped deep within the masonry flues. But for Darren, those scents were the natural hallmarks of historical timber framing. Whenever the autumn wind off the Deerfield River rattled, the antique 6/6 window sashes or the floor joists popped during sudden evening temperature drops, he simply noted the structural settling as normal character traits of an 18th century structure. However, as November of 2021 arrived and the temperatures plummeted into the low 20s, Darren began to notice a peculiar spatial discrepancy that nagged at his professional architectural instincts. Because of his background in historic preservation, Darren had an exceptional eye for structural dimensions, load-bearing proportions, and spatial symmetry. While taking detailed laser tape measurements on the ground floor to construct custom wooden shelving for his workshop tools, he measured the total length of the exterior north-facing foundation wall from the outside, which measured exactly 46 feet. Yet, when he went inside the house and measured the interior length of the back parlor and his adjoining workshop along that very same north wall, the combined interior measurement totaled only 34 feet. Even after accounting for the massive central chimney stack, double-thick lath and plaster walls, and exterior timber framing, there was an unaccounted void of approximately 12 linear feet along the rear spine of the ground floor. At first, Darren assumed that the space was merely a dead architectural cavity created during a 19th century addition, perhaps an abandoned pantry shaft or a sealed chimney support pier. But the more he looked at the layout of the back parlor, the less sense the exterior window placement made. From the outside of the house, looking at the rear facade, there were 3 identical double-hung windows spaced evenly across the lower level. Inside the house, however, there were only 2 windows visible, one in the parlor and one in his workshop. The middle window, visible clearly from the overgrown backyard garden, did not open into any room on the ground floor. It was completely obscured from the interior by a solid wall of heavy, floor-to-ceiling dark pine wainscoting paneling that ran along the east side of the fireplace. On the evening of the 24th of November 2021, the night before Thanksgiving, a heavy, freezing rainstorm rolled across western Massachusetts, trapping Darren inside the house with the wood stove burning hot. Armed with a pry bar, a heavy rubber mallet, a carpenter level, and a high-intensity work light, Darren decided to investigate the dead space behind the paneling once and for all. He set up the work light in the back parlor, illuminating the dark pine boards that lined the chimney alcove. He ran his fingers along the joints of the vertical planks, searching for the telltale head of modern drywall screws or antique cut nails. As his hand brushed against the lower right section of the center raised panel, roughly 2 inches above the baseboard molding, he felt a subtle, spring-loaded give in the wood. Darren knelt down on the pine floorboards, shining his light directly into the fine vertical seam between the panels. There, concealed within a recessed groove in the wood, was a small, hand-forged iron latch mechanism, completely unpainted and virtually invisible to anyone not actively searching for a seam. Darren placed the tip of his flathead screwdriver into the latch channel and applied firm upward pressure. With a dull, dry snap that echoed through the quiet house, the internal iron catch disengaged. A 6-foot-tall section of the solid pine wainscoting swung outward by 2 inches, revealing a concealed door frame set flush into the framing timbers. The air that poured through the freshly opened seam was shockingly frigid, thick with the heavy, sweet scent of ancient lime dust, dry cedar shavings, and cold, damp wool that had remained sealed away from sunlight for decades. Darren stood up slowly, gripping the heavy rubber mallet in his right hand and switching on a high-powered tactical LED flashlight with his left. He pulled the concealed pine panel completely open on its hidden iron pintle hinges. The beam of his flashlight cut through a dense curtain of undisturbed cobwebs, illuminating a narrow, rectangular secret room that measured roughly 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, positioned directly between the back of the parlor wall and the exterior timber siding of the house. The room possessed a low ceiling made of exposed, rough-sawn joists, completely insulated with dense layers of horsehair and compressed newspaper clippings dating back to the late 1930s. The middle window that Darren had observed from the exterior was indeed located in the center of the outer wall, but the interior side of the glass had been thoroughly blacked out using heavy coats of dark oil-based enamel paint, preventing any light from leaking out into the yard. Darren stepped across the wooden threshold, his boots crunching loudly over a thin layer of dry plaster chips that had flaked away from the framing. The room was not empty. It was entirely, meticulously furnished as a private, self-contained living compartment. Against the far back wall sat a single, narrow iron cot fitted with an old horsehair mattress, neatly made with a faded patchwork quilt and 2 rough wool blankets. Beside the bed rested a low wooden nightstand crafted from unfinished pine boards. Sitting atop the nightstand was an unlit kerosene lamp with an intact glass chimney, a half-empty box of wooden strike-anywhere matches, a pair of wire-rimmed reading spectacles, and an open ceramic shaving mug containing a dried boar bristle brush. Darren approached the cot slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs in the dead silence of the hidden room. He moved the beam of the flashlight toward the center of the chamber, where a small wooden writing desk sat positioned against the interior wall. Resting on the surface of the desk was an old mechanical portable typewriter with a blank sheet of discolored rag paper rolled halfway around the rubber platen. Beside the typewriter sat a small stack of leather-bound personal journals, bound with thick twine. Darren stepped up to the desk, set the rubber mallet down on the floorboards, and pulled his clean cotton work gloves from his pocket to handle the delicate historical artifacts. He gently lifted the top journal from the stack, carefully untying the faded twine. He opened the front cover. Written across the inside page in sharp black fountain pen ink was a single name, accompanied by a series of precise date ranges extending from the 12th of October, 1974, all the way through the 3rd of March 2018. Darren turned the brittle pages, scanning the entries. The writing was not a collection of personal memoirs or historical family reflections. It was an exhaustive, daily observational log tracking the movements of the house's primary occupants over 44 continuous years. The journal detailed exact waking times, meal preparations, daily arguments, financial discussions, and medical routines of the previous elderly family members who had owned the house, recorded in clinical, emotionless detail. Darren felt a cold wave of nausea rise in the back of his throat. He looked down at the entry dated the 3rd of March 2018, the day the final elderly occupant of the house had suffered a fatal medical emergency in the front parlor. The entry read, "The ambulance has arrived at the front gate. The paramedics are loading the stretcher. The house is now clear. I will remain inside the framing until the estate settles." Darren stood frozen, his eyes scanning the final lines of the page. The bank had taken possession of the house in late 2019, and the house had supposedly sat vacant until Darren moved in 2 months ago in September of 2021. Darren slowly closed the journal and reached for the second notebook beneath it on the stack. This notebook was entirely different. It was a modern, plastic-covered spiral notebook, completely fresh and devoid of age-related discoloration. Darren flipped open the front cover. Across the first page, written in fresh blue ballpoint ink, was the date, the 18th of September, 2021, the exact date Darren had moved into the property. The journal continued with hundreds of daily log entries running up to the present week. September 22nd. The new owner is a woodworker. He sleeps in the northwest bedroom. He drinks coffee at 6:15 in the morning. He works until 11 at night. October 14th. He is measuring the parlor floorboards. He is getting closer to the chimney stack. November 24th. He has brought a hammer and a pry bar into the parlor at 9 in the evening. Darren dropped the notebook onto the desk as if it had burned his skin. He spun around in the narrow space, his flashlight beam trembling violently as he shone the light across the hidden chamber. There, resting directly at the foot of the iron cot, which he had initially mistaken for an old roll of canvas, was a pair of modern, fleece-lined winter slippers, completely clean and lightly damp from fresh perspiration. Beside the slippers sat a small, battery-operated digital audio baby monitor receiver plugged into a hidden extension cord behind the wainscoting, actively picking up the loud, heavy sound of Darren's own breathing echoing back through the speaker. And from directly above the ceiling joists of the secret room, in the pitch-black crawlspace tucked between the ground floor ceiling and the second-floor subfloor, Darren heard the faint, distinct sound of a floorboard shifting under slow, deliberate human weight, followed by the quiet click of a metal latch being drawn back directly above his head. Darren did not pause to look up into the ceiling rafters. Pure survival reflex took command of his limbs. He threw himself backward through the open concealed panel, tumbling onto the wide pine floorboards of the back parlor. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard the sharp splintering of dry lathwood as a rectangular ceiling trapdoor dropped open directly inside the secret room behind him, sending a heavy cloud of gray horsehair insulation swirling into the beam of his work lamp. Darren grabbed the edge of the heavy wainscoting panel, slammed it shut into its frame, and shoved the heavy oak timber workbench across the floorboards, wedging its massive 100-pound frame tight against the hidden seam. From inside the wall came a series of violent, heavy impacts as someone threw their body weight against the pine paneling, rattling the framing timbers of the chimney breast. Darren did not wait for the wood to give way. He bolted across the parlor, tore through the front hallway, snatched his phone and truck keys from the entry table, and burst through the front door into the freezing rain. He jumped into his pickup truck, locked the cab doors, threw the transmission into reverse, and backed down the unpaved lane at breakneck speed until he reached the paved road, immediately dialing 911. Within 15 minutes, 4 cruisers from the Greenfield Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police sped down Silver Street, their blue and red emergency strobes cutting through the sheets of cold rain. 6 armed officers breached the front entrance of the colonial house with service weapons drawn, clearing the parlor, workshop, and upper bedrooms before systematically breaching the sealed void behind the chimney. When officers forced back the heavy wainscoting and secured the secret room, the space was empty, but the ceiling hatch remained hanging wide. Tactical officers climbed into the ceiling void, following a reinforced plywood crawlway that ran between the floor joists of the entire house, directly connecting the secret chamber to the unfinished attic and down into an old exterior bulkhead beneath the rear porch. A perimeter search team with K9 units quickly tracked fresh footprints in the muddy garden soil behind the property, discovering an elderly, emaciated man hiding inside a dry drainage culvert beneath the stone wall at the edge of the woods, shivering in soaked clothing. When detectives processed the fingerprints and medical records of the 71-year-old man, the full, incomprehensible history of the Greenfield Saltbox House came into terrifying focus. The man was identified as Arthur Sterling, the youngest son of the original patriarch who had owned the house in the mid-20th century. Arthur had been officially reported missing and presumed dead by Massachusetts authorities in the winter of 1974, following what family members had claimed was a catastrophic drowning accident in the Deerfield River during an ice storm. In reality, Arthur had never left the property. Following a severe psychological breakdown in his early 20s, the deeply insular patriarchal family had constructed the concealed chamber behind the central fireplace wainscoting, hiding Arthur away from the public, social services, and the law. For 44 consecutive years, while his siblings and parents grew old, managed the estate, and eventually died off one by one, Arthur had lived as an invisible inhabitant within the hollow cavities of the house. He moved through the crawl spaces in total silence, descending into the kitchen in the dead of night to gather leftover food, observing the passage of decades entirely through small peepholes cut into the lath and plaster behind wall clocks and vintage mirrors. When the last living family member suffered a fatal heart attack in the parlor in 2018, Arthur simply retreated into the structural framing, continuing his subterranean existence while the house sat bank-owned and vacant for nearly 2 years, surviving on stockpiled non-perishable goods and water collected from an old gravity-fed cistern in the basement. When Darren Kelly purchased the property in the fall of 2021, Arthur did not see the new owner as an intruder to attack, but as a new subject to catalog and observe. He had adapted to Darren's woodworking schedule, listening to every phone call through the floorboards, tracking every step Darren took with the laser tape measure, and retreating into the upper ceiling cavity whenever Darren worked too close to the hidden panel. Arthur Sterling was taken into protective medical custody and transferred to a state psychiatric care facility in Worcester, where he was provided with intensive psychological treatment after spending nearly half a century sealed away from the outside world. Darren Kelly spent the following 3 days packing his tools and conservation equipment into a moving trailer under private security supervision. He broke his purchase agreement through legal arbitration on grounds of non-disclosed structural habitation, returned to the Boston area, and permanently shifted his furniture restoration business into modern, open commercial studios, never again setting foot inside a historical home without checking every square inch behind the walls. If you take a look at the official visitor statistics for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you will find that it is by far the most visited national park in the entire United States. Over 12 million people travel there every single year to drive along the scenic mountain ridges, take photographs of the rolling blue mist, and hike the paved paths. But what most casual tourists never realize is that once you leave the crowded observation decks near Newfound Gap and cut deep into the roadless backcountry along the North Carolina border, you are entering one of the most rugged, ancient, and unforgiving wilderness areas on the continent. There are drainages back there that have no marked trails. There are ridges where fallen hemlocks have stacked up 20 feet high over decades of rot, forming massive, impenetrable wooden mazes. And throughout the deep ravines of Cocke County and Haywood County, there are hollows where sound does not behave properly, where compass needles spin erratically near old iron deposits, and where the mountain silence feels deliberate and heavy. Search and rescue personnel who have worked those trails for decades will tell you that people go missing in the Smokies every single year. Most of the time, it comes down to standard backcountry hazards: a lost footing on a slick granite ledge, sudden hypothermia when an autumn cold front rolls over the peaks, or someone simply losing the path after sunset. But every once in a long while, an incident occurs deep in those timber basins that completely defies any logical or rational explanation. In early November of 2016, 3 close friends from Charlotte, North Carolina, decided to test their skills against one of the most notoriously isolated backcountry routes in the entire park. The group consisted of 29-year-old structural engineer Nathan Cross, 30-year-old high school biology teacher Elena Ruiz, and 27-year-old software designer Julian Reed. Nathan was the experienced leader of the trio. He was an ultra-marathon trail runner, an expert land navigator, and had completed multiple through hikes along the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide. Elena was meticulous, calm under pressure, and handled the group's field logistics and medical supplies. Julian was young, athletic, and enthusiastic, carrying high-end digital recording gear to document the trip for his outdoor blog. On the morning of Thursday, November 10, 2016, the three friends loaded their gear into Nathan's silver Subaru Outback and drove west toward the remote Big Creek entrance of the Great Smoky Mountains. Their objective was a demanding, off-trail 72-hour loop into an extremely isolated pocket of old-growth timber located beneath the sheer eastern wall of Mount Sterling, specifically focusing on an unmonitored ravine known on older topographic maps as Deep Gap Gorge. The route was infamous among regional mountaineers. There were no maintained park trails, no footbridges over the freezing mountain streams, and zero cellular reception for a 15-mile radius. It required navigating through dense rhododendron hells, scaling slippery limestone cliffs, and bushwhacking through dense stands of ancient red spruce. Before setting out onto the rough logging trace that marked the start of the trek, the trio stopped at a small, weathered country store near the edge of the Cherokee National Forest boundary to buy extra batteries and local topo sheets. Behind the worn counter stood an older clerk in his late 70s named Clem Holcomb, wearing a faded, quilted vest and sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. Clem watched Nathan spread out their quadrant maps across the glass display case. When Clem saw Nathan trace a red grease pencil line directly through the center of Deep Gap Gorge, the old clerk set his mug down and wiped his hands on a rag. Clem looked up, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he evaluated the three young hikers. He told them in a low, gravelly voice that Deep Gap was not a place to take lightly in late autumn. He explained that once the sun dipped below the crest of Mount Sterling, the darkness pooled in that gorge like water in a bucket, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. Then Clem leaned forward, his voice dropping into a quiet, raspy whisper. He told Nathan that if they insisted on pushing into the gorge, they needed to keep their boots together, build a bright fire before dark, and if they stumbled across any old dry stone chimneys standing alone in the brush, they were not to camp within 300 yards of the foundation. Nathan thanked the old man politely, giving Elena and Julian a small, amused look. To them, it was just the standard Appalachian folklore that locals love to tell out-of-towners. They bought their gear, walked out into the chilly 39-degree morning air, and drove the remaining 3 miles to the gravel access road. By 8:30 that morning, Nathan, Elena, and Julian had shouldered their 50-pound internal frame packs and stepped off the gravel road into the dense timber. The first 6 hours of the hike went smoothly. The autumn foliage was in its final stages, with bare maple and birch branches standing against the gray sky like pale rib cages, while the dense evergreens below kept the valley floor dark and shadowy. Nathan navigated with precision, using a military Lensatic compass and physical maps to guide them through the steep switchbacks and rocky creek beds. Julian documented the entire trek with his handheld camera, filming the sweeping views from the lower ridges and recording Elena explaining the unique moss and fungal species growing along the damp stream banks. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the trio descended into the deep, enclosed bowl of Deep Gap Gorge. The atmosphere inside the ravine was immediately noticeable. The steep granite walls of Mount Sterling rose hundreds of feet above them on both sides, blocking out the daylight and trapping a dense, freezing mist that rolled off the upper peaks. The air was cold, damp, and heavy, with the scent of wet slate, rotting pine needles, and sweet river mud. Around 4:15, as the light began to fade into a dim, watery gray, Elena spotted a flat clearing nestled against a high limestone bluff roughly 50 yards above the creek. It was a natural terrace sheltered from the rising mountain wind by a massive wall of wild rhododendron, But as the three hikers walked into the center of the clearing to drop their packs, Julian stopped in his tracks, pointing his camera toward the edge of the tree line. Standing 20 feet back inside the tangled briars, covered in thick green moss and creeping ivy, was an old, hand-stacked fieldstone chimney. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, perfectly preserved, but there was no house attached to it. There were no rotted foundation beams, no rusted tin roof scraps, and no signs of an old homestead. Well, it was just a solitary, towering stone pillar standing completely alone in the virgin timber. Julian laughed, stepping closer to film the stonework, commenting on how wild it was to find the exact structure the old store clerk had warned them about. Elena checked her watch, noting that the temperature had already dropped to 32 degrees and that sunset was less than 40 minutes away. She suggested that despite the old man's superstition, the terrace was the only flat, dry ground for 3 miles in either direction, and moving in the dark along the gorge floor would be dangerously reckless. Nathan agreed. They set up their 2 lightweight dome tents side by side in the center of the clearing, secured the rainflies against the freezing mist, and gathered dry spruce branches to build a small, controlled campfire. By 7 in the evening, the gorge was plunged into total, suffocating blackness. The 3 friends sat close to the fire, eating warm, freeze-dried meals and drinking hot tea. The mood was relaxed and cheerful. Julian was reviewing footage on his camera screen, Elena was writing notes in her field journal, and Nathan was studying the map coordinates for the next morning's ascent up the western ridge. Then, right around 7:45, the mountain went completely silent. It was not a gradual fading of natural background noise. In a single, jarring split second, the steady sound of the rushing creek 50 yards below seemed to drop to a distant, muffled whisper. The wind through the spruce boughs died out entirely. The crickets, night birds, and small animals rustling through the leaf litter vanished. Nathan lowered his map, his eyes darting toward the dark tree line. Elena stopped writing, looking up with a confused frown, asking if anyone else felt the sudden change in air pressure. Julian set his camera down on a flat rock. The air around the camp clearing had grown bitterly cold, dropping well below freezing in a matter of seconds, and a faint chemical smell began to drift through the mist. It smelled like sulfur, scorched copper, and wet animal fur. Nathan stood up, reaching down to his belt to unclip his high-powered tactical flashlight. He clicked the light on, aiming the bright white beam toward the dark perimeter of the clearing. The beam cut through the swirling gray fog, illuminating the skeletal branches of the hemlocks and the dark leaves of the rhododendron thickets. There was nothing there. Then, from the deep timber, roughly 40 yards behind the solitary stone chimney, came a sound. It was a human whistle. It was not the sharp, shrill blast of an emergency whistle, nor was it the warble of an owl. It was a low, slow, melodic 3-note whistle. The first note was low, the second note jumped an entire octave, and the third note dropped back down, trailing off into a raspy, dry hiss. Julian reached for his camera, whispering to Nathan, asking if another hiking group was moving off-trail in the dark. Nathan did not answer. His instincts were firing warnings. He kept his flashlight beam pinned on the stone chimney, his body tense and ready. He called out into the darkness, identifying their group and asking if whoever was out there needed assistance. His voice echoed off the sheer granite bluffs and died into the freezing fog. There was no verbal response. Instead, from the base of the stone chimney, the 3-note whistle sounded again. Except this time, it was not 40 yards away in the timber. It came from right behind the stone pillar, barely 20 feet from where the 3 hikers were standing by the fire. Elena scrambled to her feet, backing up toward the tents, her face pale in the lantern light. Nathan swept the flashlight beam directly onto the base of the chimney. The bright light illuminated the mossy gray fieldstones, the damp earth, and the creeping ivy. And then, stepping slowly out from behind the stone pillar into the full glare of the light, the silhouette emerged into the clearing. The figure stepped completely into the firelight, moving with a disjointed, agonizingly slow gait. It was nearly 7 feet tall, unnervingly thin, with pale, hairless skin that looked like damp parchment stretched over a skeletal frame. Its arms hung impossibly low, its elongated fingers almost brushing the frozen earth, tipped with thick, jagged black nails. Its head was tilted at an unnatural 90-degree angle toward its left shoulder. The creature had no hair, no visible nose, and its mouth was a wide, jagged slit that twitched in time with its shallow, wet breathing. But what paralyzed the group was its eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and entirely milky white, reflecting the dancing campfire flames like two pieces of polished glass. Julian lifted his video camera on pure reflex, his hands shaking so violently that the small LCD screen blurred with motion. The creature stopped 5 feet past the chimney. It did not roar. It did not growl. Instead, it opened its wide jaw, revealing rows of small, crowded, human-like teeth, and let out that same raspy three-note whistle. Elena screamed, the sound echoing sharply off the sheer granite cliffs of Mount Sterling. The scream shattered the standoff. In a terrifying, instantaneous blur of movement, the creature dropped onto all fours and lunged forward across the clearing. It did not move like a bear or a mountain lion. Its limbs bent and rotated with an impossible, sickening fluidity, launching its body across the open ground in less than a second. Nathan shouted at everyone to run, swinging his heavy steel flashlight with all his strength directly at the creature's head. The heavy metal casing struck the creature across its pale cheek with a dull, sickening crack. The blow barely slowed it down. The creature swiped a massive, pale hand sideways, catching Nathan across the chest. The raw, concussive force lifted Nathan entirely off his feet, sending him crashing backward through the side of his dome tent, shattering the aluminum poles and tearing through the nylon rainfly. Through the tangled fabric, Nathan scrambled to his knees, his vision swimming with stars, just in time to see the creature grab Julian by his heavy rucksack. Julian fought desperately, kicking and swinging his fists, his dropped camera tumbling onto the leaves with the red recording light still blinking. With effortless, monstrous power, the creature hoisted Julian into the air and hurled him backward toward the dense wall of rhododendron at the edge of the terrace. Julian hit the brush with a heavy thud, let out a single, sharp cry of agony, and was instantly dragged into the deep timber by an unseen force. Elena, paralyzed by sheer panic, sprinted toward the rocky trail leading down into the gorge. Nathan dragged himself out of the shredded tent, screaming for Elena to stop and stay in the open. Through the freezing mist, Nathan saw a second, pale, elongated shape drop silently from the high hemlock branches above the path, landing directly in front of Elena. Elena tried to pivot, but the second creature lunged, wrapping its long, gray limbs around her shoulders. Elena let out one final, terrified gasp before being pulled down the steep, rocky embankment into the pitch-black ravine below. The entire attack took less than 30 seconds. Nathan knew there was nothing he could do. He had no weapon, his gear was destroyed, and two entities were hunting the clearing. Acting purely on survival instinct, Nathan scrambled toward the freezing, rushing waters of the creek 50 yards down the slope. He threw himself into the icy mountain current, letting the waist-deep water carry his battered body downstream over jagged boulders and slick riverbeds. He did not look back. He did not call out their names. He allowed the freezing water to pull him through the dark gorge for nearly 3 miles, fighting the numbing cold that crept into his limbs until he finally washed ashore on a gravel sandbar near the lower valley boundary. Nathan crawled on his hands and knees up to the Big Creek logging trace, shivering uncontrollably, his clothes torn to shreds and his body covered in deep contusions and lacerations. Just past 5 in the morning on Friday, November 11th, an early morning maintenance crew from the National Park Service found Nathan collapsed on the side of the gravel road, suffering from severe hypothermia, shock, and a fractured collarbone. When search and rescue teams, accompanied by local law enforcement and bloodhounds, pushed into Deep Gap Gorge later that afternoon, they found the abandoned campsite completely decimated. Both tents had been torn to ribbons, sleeping bags were shredded, and personal gear was scattered across the terrace. The search teams recovered Julian's video camera, resting in the damp leaves near the stone chimney. The outer casing was severely cracked, but technicians were able to recover the final 30 seconds of footage. The video showed Nathan hitting the pale figure with his flashlight, followed by a chaotic burst of static, a glimpse of wide, milky white eyes staring into the lens, and the faint, chilling sound of a 3-note whistle echoing through the dark. Despite an exhaustive 9-day ground and air search covering over 12,000 acres of dense wilderness, not a single trace of Elena Ruiz or Julian Reed was ever found. No footprints, no clothing, and no remains were ever recovered from the gorge. The official government report listed their disappearances as an unsolved backcountry missing persons case, attributing Nathan's account to acute hypothermia-induced hallucinations and psychological trauma. Nathan Cross moved out of North Carolina entirely, relocated to the flat desert of Arizona, and never returned to the Appalachian Mountains. The Park Service quietly closed the unmarked route into Deep Gap Gorge the following spring, removing all references to the drainage from updated topographic trail guides. And if you ever meet the old locals who live near the base of Mount Sterling, they will tell you that the solitary stone chimney still stands in that forgotten clearing, and that on cold November nights when the mist rolls off the peaks, you can still hear 3 familiar notes drifting through the trees. If you take a drive into the northern panhandle of West Virginia, cutting deep through the rugged, winding ridges of Preston County, you will find places where modern maps simply stop giving you details. The terrain is a maze of steep sandstone hollows, thick stands of black walnut and red spruce, and forgotten logging routes that were laid down well over a century ago. In these isolated mountain valleys, you can find small settlements that never appeared on standard highway maps. These were not official towns with city halls or post offices. They were tight-knit, multi-generational enclaves. Families who had lived off the land for 200 years, raising livestock, running small independent timber mills, and relying strictly on deep water wells and wood stoves. They did not trust outside authority, they rarely traveled down into the county seat of Kingwood, and they preferred to keep to themselves. And in that part of the state, the older folks will tell you that the deep gaps between the ridges have a strange way of closing in on people. They have old stories about entire families that packed up and left in the dead of night, never to be heard from again. But there was one place, a hidden valley community known locally as High Knob Hollow, that did not simply pack up. In late October of 2017, High Knob Hollow did not slowly fade away. It simply ceased to exist overnight, leaving behind a silence so unnatural that even the local foresters refused to walk the boundary lines. In the autumn of 2017, a 34-year-old county property tax assessor and land appraiser named Patrick Ross received an unusual assignment from the Preston County Clerk. Patrick was a practical, detail-oriented man from Morgantown. He spent 5 days a week driving a county-issued white Ford Escape down narrow gravel switchbacks, documenting property boundaries, verifying parcel deeds, and assessing rural timber acreage for regional zoning records. He was not a superstitious person. He was a numbers man, methodical, equipped with laser measuring tools, satellite GIS receivers, and detailed legal ledgers dating back to the late 19th century. His assignment was to conduct a comprehensive boundary assessment of a 700-acre parcel nestled deep inside High Knob Hollow. The enclave was home to approximately 32 permanent residents, all members of 5 interconnected families: the Hallowells, the Gentrys, the Ricketts, the Mayhews, and the Calloway clan. According to the county records, not a single representative from the Hollow had filed property taxes, registered a vehicle, or visited the Kingwood feed supply store in over 4 months. On the morning of Wednesday, October 25th, 2017, Patrick packed his equipment: a sturdy clipboard with parcel maps, a digital Nikon field camera, an extra handheld radio, and a heavy thermos of black coffee. The weather that morning was cold, damp, and overcast, with thick, gray autumn fog hanging low over the Cheat River Basin. Before driving out to the unmaintained dirt road that led into the high hollow, Patrick stopped at a small country diner and feed depot outside the community of Fellowsville to ask for directions to the old access trail. Behind the counter was an older man in a faded work vest named Earl Jenkins, who had delivered bulk propane and livestock feed throughout the county for 40 years. Earl looked at the parcel maps on Patrick's clipboard and immediately recognized the narrow valley marked between the two jagged ridgelines. Earl looked up, his expression turning sharp and wary. He asked Patrick why on earth he was heading up into the High Knob drainage this late in the year. Patrick explained his job plainly, telling Earl that the county needed an updated headcount and land valuation for the upcoming fiscal cycle, and that the office had been unable to reach anyone by landline, phone, or registered mail. Earl set his coffee pot down with a heavy clatter, leaned his forearms against the counter, and spoke in a low, measured voice. Earl told Patrick that he had driven his bulk propane truck up to the gate of High Knob Hollow back in early August to make a routine delivery to the Mayhew farm. But when he arrived at the wooden cattle guard at the entrance of the valley, the heavy iron chain was locked from the inside. The road was completely overgrown with wild weeds, and not a single chimney in the entire hollow was putting up wood smoke. Earl told Patrick that the valley felt dead, that there was not a dog barking, not a chicken clucking, and that the air smelled like scorched limestone. Earl looked Patrick dead in the eye and told him that whatever was going on up in that hollow, it was not something a tax assessor should be messing with. Patrick thanked the man for the warning, but he had a job to do and a supervisor expecting a completed report by Friday afternoon. He finished his coffee, climbed back into the Ford Escape, and headed up the winding mountain backroads. By 10 in the morning, Patrick reached the end of the paved county highway and turned onto the unmarked gravel track leading into the deep gap of High Knob Hollow. The road deteriorated rapidly. It was narrow, rutted with deep washouts from recent autumn rains, and hemmed in by massive, ancient red spruces whose branches leaned outward over the path, blocking out almost all natural sunlight. The further Patrick drove into the valley, the colder the air became. The dashboard thermometer on his vehicle dropped steadily from 48 degrees down to 34 degrees within a span of 3 miles. At 10:45, the track ended abruptly at a heavy, hand-hewn oak gate stretched across the entrance of the valley. Patrick stepped out of his vehicle into the freezing mountain mist. The silence was immediate and heavy. There was no sound of wind in the spruce needles. There was no distant hum of traffic from the highway. There were no birds calling from the ridge. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath Patrick's heavy leather work boots. The gate was secured with a thick, rusted iron chain. But when Patrick examined the lock, he noticed that the heavy brass padlock had not been pried open or cut with bolt cutters. The metal was twisted and warped, melted from the inside out, as if it had been exposed to an intense, instantaneous flash of heat that had fused the internal tumblers into slag. Patrick squeezed his body through the narrow gap between the wooden post and the fence line, shouldering his leather messenger bag containing his camera, parcel records, and satellite GPS receiver. He began walking along the overgrown dirt road that wound through the floor of the hollow. After walking for roughly half a mile, Patrick rounded a bend in the creek bed and entered the central clearing of the settlement. Spread across the flat valley floor were 6 separate homesteads: modest, weathered wood frame houses, traditional tin-roofed barns, large vegetable gardens, and a small, white-painted community chapel sitting on a low, grassy rise near the tree line. From a distance, everything looked remarkably intact. The houses stood upright, the tin roofs showed no signs of storm damage, and several older pickup trucks were parked neatly in the gravel driveways. Patrick approached the first property, the main farmhouse belonging to the Mayhew family. He stepped onto the wooden front porch, his boots creaking on the damp floorboards. The front door was wide open, resting against the interior wall. Patrick knocked loudly against the doorframe, calling out for anyone inside and identifying himself as an official representative of the county clerk's office. His voice echoed through the empty rooms and faded into the cold timber. There was no response. Patrick stepped across the threshold into the living room. The interior of the house was completely undisturbed, yet it felt as though time had suddenly stopped in the middle of a regular morning. On the kitchen table sat 4 ceramic plates, each containing half-eaten portions of scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, and thick slices of cured ham. A cast-iron skillet rested on the cold, wood-burning stove, containing cold grease that had congealed into a white wax. A small porcelain pitcher of milk sat on the counter, long spoiled, with a crust of dried cream around the rim. Patrick pulled out his camera and began taking wide-angle documentation photos of the room. He walked down the narrow hallway into the master bedroom. The double bed was made neatly, with a heavy patchwork quilt pulled taut over the mattress. On the wooden nightstand sat a pair of reading glasses resting on top of an open family Bible. On the dresser sat 2 sets of car keys, a leather wallet containing $65 in cash, and 3 uncashed Social Security checks dating back to July of 2017. There were no signs of a struggle, there were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, and no forced entry. It looked as though the family had simply stood up from the breakfast table, walked out the front door, and vanished into thin air. Patrick left the Mayhew house feeling a cold, prickling knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He walked across the muddy road to the neighboring property, a large red timber barn and workshop belonging to the Gentry family. Inside the barn, Patrick found 2 John Deere tractors parked side by side, their fuel tanks half full and the keys resting in the ignition switches. In the adjacent animal stalls, the heavy wooden gates were wide open, but the stalls were completely empty. There were no cattle, no horses, and no pigs. Patrick walked out into the rear pasture to check the livestock perimeter fence. When he reached the wire fence line near the edge of the forest, he stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy 4-strand barbed wire was intact, but every single wooden fence post along a 100-yard stretch had been charred black on the side facing the mountain ridge, scorched down to carbonized wood, while the grass directly beneath the wire remained green and untouched. Patrick checked his handheld satellite GPS unit to mark the coordinates. The digital screen flickered wildly. The coordinate readout danced erratically between numbers, jumping hundreds of miles off target before freezing completely on a blank gray screen with a flashing hardware error code. Patrick pulled his county-issued 2-way radio from his belt, switched the channel to the regional emergency dispatch frequency, and keyed the microphone. Static roared through the small speaker, a harsh, deafening white noise that crackled with rhythmic, pulsing bursts of electromagnetic interference. Patrick released the button, the silence returning with suffocating weight. By 1:30 in the afternoon, Patrick had inspected all 6 homesteads. Every single home told the exact same terrifying story. Food left half-prepared on stoves, coats hanging on pegs by the doors, vehicles parked in driveways with full gas tanks, personal belongings, money, heirlooms, and family photographs left entirely untouched. 32 people had vanished without leaving a single tire track, a single set of boot prints, or a single shred of physical evidence pointing to an evacuation. The only structure left to inspect was the small, white-painted community chapel on the grassy rise. Patrick walked up the wooden stairs of the chapel, his breath coming in shallow, nervous clouds in the freezing mist. The double oak doors of the chapel were shut tight. Patrick gripped the heavy brass handle, turned it, and pushed the doors open. The interior of the church was dark, lit only by the pale, gray light filtering through the clear glass windows along the nave. Patrick stepped inside, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him with a soft, ominous latch. The wooden pews were completely empty, arranged in neat rows facing the raised altar at the front of the sanctuary. Patrick walked slowly down the center aisle, the sound of his boots echoing against the high wooden rafters. When he reached the front pew, he looked down at the altar and his blood turned completely to ice. Lying on top of the polished wooden communion table, arranged in an exact symmetrical circle, were 32 small, identical items. They were silver and tin pocket knives, the traditional folding knives that Appalachian men, women, and older children carried in their front pockets every day of their lives. Each knife was opened to its main blade, with the point of the blade facing inward toward the center of the table. And in the exact center of that circle of knives, resting on the white linen altar cloth, was a single, fist-sized piece of smooth, black stone that Patrick had never seen in any geological survey of the Appalachian Basin. The stone was not shale, limestone, or coal. It was perfectly spherical, completely matte black, and seemed to absorb the dim gray light of the room, casting an oily, shimmering distortion in the air directly around it. Patrick reached out a gloved hand, his fingers trembling, hovering inches above the strange black sphere. And at that exact second, the heavy oak doors of the chapel slammed shut with the force of a thunderclap, locking from the outside with a heavy, mechanical slide of iron. The temperature inside the church plummeted instantly below freezing, Patrick's breath billowing out in thick white clouds, and from the deep, dark spaces above the ceiling rafters, the sound began. It was not a human voice. It was a low, resonant, metallic humming that vibrated through the floorboards, through the pews, and deep into the marrow of Patrick's bones, accompanied by the slow, rhythmic sound of dozens of bare feet pacing softly across the roof above his head. Patrick froze in front of the communion table, every nerve ending screaming in sheer terror. The metallic hum vibrating through the timber frame grew louder, rising to a piercing, high-pitched resonance that made his vision blur and his teeth ache in his jaw. Above him, the sound of dozens of bare feet pacing across the tin roof multiplied, moving with a frantic, scuttling cadence that sounded less like human steps and more like an army of insects crawling across the metal sheets. Patrick pulled his hand back from the black sphere, turned on his heels, and sprinted down the center aisle toward the double oak doors. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy wood, rattling the frame violently. The doors were locked fast, sealed by whatever heavy iron bolt had slid into place on the outside. He looked around in pure desperation. Along the sides of the nave were the tall, narrow glass windows. Patrick unslung his heavy leather field bag, raised it over his shoulder, and smashed it hard into the lower glass pane of the nearest window. The old glass shattered with a loud crash, spraying jagged shards across the damp grass outside. Using his forearm to knock away the remaining points of glass, Patrick scrambled up onto the wooden sill and threw himself headfirst through the narrow frame, tumbling hard onto the frozen mud and briars beside the chapel foundation. He hit the ground, rolled onto his back, and looked up at the church roof. Crouched along the ridge cap of the tin roof, perfectly still, were dozens of figures. They were tall, gaunt, and completely hairless, with pale, leathery skin the color of wet river slate. Their limbs were elongated and skeletal, bent at jagged angles to grip the sharp edges of the tin with long, jointed digits. But what caused Patrick's breath to choke in his throat were the clothes they wore. Draped across their emaciated frames were the tattered remnants of denim overalls, cotton dresses, and flannel shirts, the clothes belonging to the 32 residents of High Knob Hollow. Their faces were smooth, devoid of eyes, ears, or noses, featuring only a pale expanse of stretched skin and a single, circular opening in the center of their heads that vibrated with that deafening metallic hum. In unison, every single figure slowly tilted its head down toward Patrick. Patrick scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from his bruised shoulder, and ran blindly toward the valley gate. He did not look back. He sprinted through the overgrown grass of the central road, his heart slamming violently against his ribs. Behind him, the sound of metal tearing and branches violently snapping signaled that the figures had dropped from the roof and were pursuing him through the dense spruce thickets on either side of the road. They moved through the timber at horrifying speed, not running on the ground, but pulling themselves through the high spruce boughs, their long gray limbs bending the thick wood with terrifying force. The metallic humming echoed from every direction, bouncing off the sheer sandstone bluffs and turning the hollow into a disorienting chamber of sound. Patrick reached the hand-hewn oak gate, threw himself between the wooden post and the melted iron chain, and burst onto the gravel track where his vehicle was parked. He scrambled into the driver's seat of the Ford Escape, locked the doors, and slammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, sputtered, and caught, roaring to life. Patrick slammed the transmission into reverse, spun the steering wheel wildly, and threw the vehicle into drive, speeding down the rutted mountain back road at full throttle. Through his rearview mirror, illuminated in the red glare of his taillights, Patrick saw several pale, elongated shapes drop silently from the spruce branches onto the gravel road behind him, standing in the fog, watching his vehicle disappear down the switchbacks. Patrick did not stop until he reached the bright lights and paved streets of Morgantown. The next morning, Patrick submitted his formal resignation to the Preston County Clerk's office. He handed in his badge, his keys, and his parcel ledgers, but he made no mention of what he had seen inside the chapel or on the roof. 2 weeks later, the Preston County government officially closed the High Knob Hollow parcel case, reclassifying the 700-acre tract as permanently abandoned and transferring the deed into an unmonitored state forestry reserve. In the spring of 2018, a heavy-duty state maintenance crew was sent up the logging track to place concrete barrier blocks across the entrance road to prevent illegal dumping. When the workers arrived, they found that the entire forest floor within the hollow had turned completely gray and brittle, with every red spruce within a half-mile radius standing dead, their needles stripped cleanly away. Patrick Ross moved to flat farmland in central Ohio, taking a job in commercial real estate far away from the Appalachian ridges. And to this day, whenever anyone asks him about his time surveying the deep timber of West Virginia, Patrick gives them only one piece of advice. There are hollows in those ancient mountains that were emptied for a reason, and if you ever come across a gate locked from the inside, you turn around, you walk away, and you never look back. If you have ever spent time looking at rural real estate along the northern spine of the Allegheny Mountains in central Pennsylvania, out through the dense ridges of Centre County and Clearfield County, you know that there are properties tucked away in those hills that look like something out of a fantasy. You have these massive, multi-acre homesteads surrounded by old-growth white pines, mountain laurels, and roaring trout streams, listed for prices that seem almost too good to be true for someone moving away from a crowded, expensive metropolitan area. To someone from the outside, these secluded homes look like the absolute definition of American tranquility. You have total privacy, pure mountain air, and miles of undisturbed wilderness stretching right off your back porch. But if you talk to the generational families who have lived in those isolated gaps since the late 1800s, they will tell you that real estate in the deep timber carries a very specific history. They say that when an old homestead sits empty on the market for years, despite being fully renovated with modern amenities, you do not just look at the foundation or the plumbing. You ask why the previous owners walked away. You ask why a house built 80 years ago has had 6 different title transfers in less than 20 years, because in those ancient, limestone-riddled ridges, the earth underneath a house is not always solid stone. The mountains there are full of natural subterranean voids, flooded sinkholes, and forgotten fissures that run deep into the bedrock. And the old folks will tell you that if an old mountain cellar smells like cold copper and stagnant well water, even in the middle of a dry summer, you do not finish that basement into a living space. You leave the heavy wooden hatch bolted shut, you keep the lights on, and you never, under any circumstances, listen to the draft coming through the foundation stones after dark. In early September of 2021, a 34-year-old freelance medical illustrator and digital artist named Claire Bennett decided that she had found the bargain of a lifetime. Claire had lived in a cramped, noisy apartment in Philadelphia for over 8 years. Following a lucrative long-term contract with a major biomedical publisher in late 2020, Claire wanted out of the city. She wanted space, absolute quiet for her studio work, and a natural setting where she could paint without sirens and traffic outside her window. After months of browsing rural listings, she found a private sale on a 3-acre property located at the end of an unpaved logging lane known as Black Bear Hollow Road, just outside the tiny, unincorporated mountain village of Pine Glen. The house was a stunning, 2-story craftsman-style home built in the late 1930s using hand-cut riverstone and heavy chestnut timbers. It had a wraparound cedar porch, a massive stone fireplace in the great room, modern high-speed satellite internet, and a fully updated country kitchen. The entire 3-acre lot was hemmed in on all 4 sides by the dense, protected wilderness of the Sproul State Forest. What shocked Claire the most was the price tag. The property was listed at nearly 40% below regional market value. The seller, an estate liquidation attorney from Pittsburgh representing the heirs of a deceased timber surveyor, was eager to close immediately. Claire did not hesitate. She had a standard home inspection completed, which showed only minor foundation settling, typical of an older stone home, signed the closing documents, and officially took ownership on Wednesday, September 8, 2021. On Friday, September 10th, the moving truck navigated the steep gravel switchbacks, unloaded her furniture, art supplies, and boxes, and left Claire standing alone on her new front porch as the sun began to dip behind the long, forested ridge of the mountain. For the first 4 days, the home was everything Claire had ever dreamed of. The days were crisp, cool, and peaceful. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the yellowing birch leaves, the distant call of ravens across the valley, and the steady trickle of a natural spring located 40 yards behind the kitchen. She set up her main digital drafting table in the second-floor loft, where massive picture windows gave her an unobstructed view of the rugged pine ridges. The only part of the house that felt slightly out of place was the basement. The access to the lower level was not a standard indoor staircase. It was an old, heavy wooden root cellar door built into the floorboards of the rear mudroom, secured by a thick, hand-forged iron latch and a sliding steel bolt. Beneath the hatch was a flight of steep, rough-hewn stone steps descending into a cool, earth-walled cellar that housed the home's modern water heater, the well pressure tank, and an older, non-functional coal furnace that had been disconnected decades prior. The floor of the basement was rough, poured concrete, but the back wall of the cellar was entirely natural, composed of the solid, fractured gray limestone that formed the bedrock of the mountain itself. On the evening of Tuesday, September 14th, Claire was sitting in the great room around 9:30 at night. She had a fire going in the stone hearth, her laptop open, and was enjoying a cup of chamomile tea. The autumn weather had turned cold, with temperatures dropping into the low 40s under an ink-black, starless mountain sky. As she worked, the room suddenly felt noticeably colder. A sharp, icy draft drifted across the living room floorboards, chilling her ankles. Claire set her laptop aside, assuming she had left a window cracked in the rear mudroom. She stood up, walked down the narrow central hallway, and stepped into the small utility room near the back door. The back door was shut tight, its deadbolt fully engaged. The double-hung window above the laundry sink was closed and locked. Yet, the room was freezing. Claire looked down at the floor. The icy draft was rising directly through the narrow, quarter-inch seam between the heavy floorboards of the wooden cellar door. And as Claire stood in the silence of the mudroom, listening to the wind sighing outside, she heard a sound rising from the dark space beneath the floorboards. It was not the mechanical hum of the water heater. It was not the clicking of the well pressure switch. It was a faint, steady, rhythmic sound that resembled a human breath being pushed through dry teeth. Inhale, exhale. It was quiet, barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator, but it had a distinct, fluid cadence that sounded unmistakable. Claire knelt down on the cold linoleum, resting her palms against the heavy chestnut wood of the cellar hatch. She leaned her right ear close to the iron pull ring, holding her breath. From the dark, subterranean cold 12 feet below the floor, the sound shifted. It was no longer just breathing. A voice began to murmur. The voice was low, raspy, and layered, sounding like multiple people whispering the exact same words in unison, so faint that the syllables blended into a continuous, dry hiss that echoed off the damp limestone walls below. Claire could not make out individual words, but the tone of the murmuring was conversational, urgent, and seemed to move slowly from the far back corner of the cellar toward the base of the stone steps. Claire pulled her head back instantly, her heart slamming violently against her ribcage. She told herself that it had to be a natural acoustic trick. The mountains were full of limestone caverns. An underground air current passing through a fissure in the foundation wall could easily create a draft that whistled and vibrated against the old furnace pipes, creating sounds that her tired brain was misinterpreting as human speech. She double-checked the heavy sliding bolt on top of the cellar door, ensuring the iron bar was seated firmly in its bracket. She walked back to the living room, turned on every light on the ground floor, locked her bedroom door, and slept with her reading lamp on until the pale morning sun broke through the pines at 6:30. The next morning, Wednesday, September 15th, the bright autumn daylight restored Claire's sense of logic. She decided she was not going to live in fear of her own foundation. She was an adult, a homeowner, and she needed to inspect the cellar thoroughly to find the source of the draft and seal whatever gap was letting cold air in from the mountain bedrock. At 10 in the morning, Claire pulled on a pair of heavy work gloves, grabbed a heavy-duty tactical flashlight with a 3,000 lumen beam, and walked into the mudroom. She slid the heavy iron bolt back, lifted the heavy chestnut hatch, and hooked it to the wall latch. A wave of freezing, damp air surged upward from the opening, carrying a heavy, pungent odor that had not been there during the home inspection. It smelled like wet copper, sulfur, and deep, stagnant swamp water that had never seen sunlight. Claire clicked her flashlight on and walked down the steep, narrow stone steps. The basement was quiet. The concrete floor was dry, and the water heater sat in the center of the room, its small, green diagnostic light blinking steadily. Claire walked slowly to the back of the cellar, sweeping her wide beam across the natural limestone wall that formed the rear foundation. That was when she saw the opening. In the far corner, behind the rusted, obsolete casing of the old 1930s coal furnace, a massive slab of limestone had shifted. A natural, vertical fracture in the rock had widened into a dark, jagged crevice nearly 2 feet wide. Plunging horizontally back into the solid heart of the mountain, Claire stepped closer, pointing her searchlight directly into the dark void. The light penetrated about 20 feet into a natural, ancient cave tunnel that sloped downward into the black bedrock. The stone walls of the passage were smooth, slick with moisture, and covered in thin, white mineral veining. And lying on the flat stone floor just inside the opening of the crevice, bathed in the white glare of her flashlight, was an object. It was a small, child-sized wooden rocking horse carved by hand from dark oak, its red paint cracked and peeling with age. Resting neatly across the wooden seat of the toy was a modern plastic ballpoint pen from a local hardware store in Pine Glen, along with a small, folded piece of yellow legal pad paper. Claire's hands began to shake. She did not want to step through the crevice, but the realization that someone had recently been inside the stone tunnel beneath her house made her pulse spike with sheer adrenaline. She leaned forward, reached her gloved arm into the narrow opening, and snatched the folded piece of yellow paper off the wooden toy. She stepped back onto the concrete floor of the cellar, unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, and brought it into the beam of her flashlight. Written on the paper in dark, jagged handwriting that pressed so hard into the page it had torn the fibers was a single, continuous sentence written over and over from the top of the sheet to the bottom. "We hear you walking above us, Claire. We hear you walking above us, Claire." "We hear you walking above us, Claire." Claire choked on a gasp, dropping the paper onto the damp floor. She had never given her name to any local neighbors. She had moved in less than a week ago, ordering all her supplies online, and had spoken to no one in the village of Pine Glen. At that exact second, from deep inside the dark, horizontal rock crevice behind the old furnace, the sound started again. It was not a faint whisper this time. From 30 feet back in the black subterranean tunnel came the loud, clear, unmistakable sound of multiple bare feet slapping rapidly against wet stone, moving with terrifying speed up the incline toward the opening of the cellar. And as the footsteps tore through the dark rock passage, a chorus of voices rose from the stone, shouting her name in a frantic, overlapping frenzy that vibrated the concrete floor beneath her boots. "Claire! Claire! Claire! Let us out!" Claire did not look into the crevice. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She pivoted on the concrete floor, dropped the heavy tactical flashlight, and scrambled up the steep stone steps on her hands and knees. Behind her, the chorus of shrieking voices grew deafening, rising into a piercing cacophony that reverberated off the foundation walls. From the dark void behind the furnace came the violent, metallic screech of the rusted iron casing being shoved aside, followed by the wet scraping of elongated limbs clawing onto the cellar floor. Claire burst into the mudroom, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the chestnut hatch, and slammed it down with all her strength. The heavy wooden door crashed into the frame. She threw her entire body weight onto the hatch, jamming the sliding iron bolt into the steel receiver just as something slammed violently against the underside of the wood. Thump! The impact was so immense that it rattled the floorboards across the entire ground floor, lifting the hatch half an inch against the locked bolt. From directly beneath Claire's boots, separated by only 2 inches of solid chestnut timber, came a flurry of furious, frantic pounding. Dozens of small, hard objects like sharp bone or thick claws scratched and gouged against the wood, accompanied by that ragged, collective shriek, "Claire! Open the door! Claire! We are cold!" Claire scrambled backward across the linoleum, tears blinding her vision, her breath coming in ragged, suffocating gasps. She did not stop to grab her coat, her purse, or her art equipment. She snatched her car keys from the hook by the back door, kicked open the exterior entrance, and sprinted down the porch steps into the driveway. She threw herself into her vehicle, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Claire threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires against the gravel as she backed out of the turnaround. As the headlights swept across the front of the craftsman house, Claire slammed her foot on the brake in sheer, paralyzing horror. Every single window on the ground floor of the house was crowded with silhouettes. They were tall, gaunt figures with impossibly long, spindly necks and pale, hairless heads pressed flat against the glass panes. Their faces were smooth, devoid of features, except for wide, gaping, circular mouths that were vibrating silently behind the glass, fogging the interior surface with thick plumes of condensation. Slowly, dozens of long, jointed gray fingers pressed against the glass, tapping in unison against the window panes with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Claire slammed the transmission into drive and floored the accelerator. The car rocketed down the steep switchbacks of Black Bear Hollow Road, sliding dangerously around the unpaved curves, gravel spraying into the dark tree line as she fled Sproul State Forest. She did not slow down until she reached the bright, fluorescent lights of a 24-hour truck stop along Interstate 80, 30 miles away. Claire never spent another night in the house. The following week, she hired an emergency private moving company and a local real estate attorney to handle the liquidation of the property. When the moving crew arrived with a police escort to retrieve her studio supplies and personal belongings, the lead contractor reported that the interior of the house was completely intact, with one terrifying exception. The heavy chestnut root cellar door in the mudroom had been split straight down the center grain, warped by immense upward pressure and covered in thousands of deep, parallel scratches that had gouged through 2 inches of solid wood. The estate liquidation firm put the property back on the market at a drastic 60% markdown. It sat empty for 18 months before being quietly purchased by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which promptly condemned the structure. In the summer of 2022, state demolition crews tore down the Craftsman home and poured 30 tons of quick-setting concrete down the cellar steps, permanently sealing the subterranean fissure beneath 20 feet of solid stone. Claire Bennett relocated to coastal Maine, abandoning rural properties entirely for a third-floor apartment in downtown Portland. And whenever she speaks with colleagues who talk about escaping the noise of modern life for a dream home tucked deep into the Appalachian ridges, Claire always gives them the exact same warning. When a house in those ancient mountains is cheap, you do not ask what is wrong with the roof. You ask what is living under the floor. And if the basement ever starts whispering into the dark, you do not investigate, you run. If you have ever spent time looking at rural real estate along the northern spine of the Allegheny Mountains in central Pennsylvania, out through the dense ridges of Centre County and Clearfield County, you know that there are properties tucked away in those hills that look like something out of a fantasy. You have these massive, multi-acre homesteads surrounded by old-growth white pines, mountain laurels, and roaring trout streams, listed for prices that seem almost too good to be true for someone moving away from a crowded, expensive metropolitan area. To someone from the outside, these secluded homes look like the absolute definition of American tranquility. You have total privacy, pure mountain air, and miles of undisturbed wilderness stretching right off your back porch. But if you talk to the generational families who have lived in those isolated gaps since the late 1800s, they will tell you that real estate in the deep timber carries a very specific history. They say that when an old homestead sits empty on the market for years, despite being fully renovated with modern amenities, you do not just look at the foundation or the plumbing. You ask why the previous owners walked away. You ask why a house built 80 years ago has had 6 different title transfers in less than 20 years, because in those ancient, limestone-riddled ridges, the earth underneath a house is not always solid stone. The mountains there are full of natural subterranean voids, flooded sinkholes, and forgotten fissures that run deep into the bedrock. And the old folks will tell you that if an old mountain cellar smells like cold copper and stagnant well water, even in the middle of a dry summer, you do not finish that basement into a living space. You leave the heavy wooden hatch bolted shut, you keep the lights on, and you never, under any circumstances, listen to the draft coming through the foundation stones after dark. In early September of 2021, a 34-year-old freelance medical illustrator and digital artist named Claire Bennett decided that she had found the bargain of a lifetime. Claire had lived in a cramped, noisy apartment in Philadelphia for over 8 years. Following a lucrative long-term contract with a major biomedical publisher in late 2020, Claire wanted out of the city. She wanted space, absolute quiet for her studio work, and a natural setting where she could paint without sirens and traffic outside her window. After months of browsing rural listings, she found a private sale on a 3-acre property located at the end of an unpaved logging lane known as Black Bear Hollow Road, just outside the tiny, unincorporated mountain village of Pine Glen. The house was a stunning, 2-story craftsman-style home built in the late 1930s using hand-cut riverstone and heavy chestnut timbers. It had a wraparound cedar porch, a massive stone fireplace in the great room, modern high-speed satellite internet, and a fully updated country kitchen. The entire 3-acre lot was hemmed in on all 4 sides by the dense, protected wilderness of the Sproul State Forest. What shocked Claire the most was the price tag. The property was listed at nearly 40% below regional market value. The seller, an estate liquidation attorney from Pittsburgh representing the heirs of a deceased timber surveyor, was eager to close immediately. Claire did not hesitate. She had a standard home inspection completed, which showed only minor foundation settling, typical of an older stone home, signed the closing documents, and officially took ownership on Wednesday, September 8, 2021. On Friday, September 10th, the moving truck navigated the steep gravel switchbacks, unloaded her furniture, art supplies, and boxes, and left Claire standing alone on her new front porch as the sun began to dip behind the long, forested ridge of the mountain. For the first 4 days, the home was everything Claire had ever dreamed of. The days were crisp, cool, and peaceful. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the yellowing birch leaves, the distant call of ravens across the valley, and the steady trickle of a natural spring located 40 yards behind the kitchen. She set up her main digital drafting table in the second-floor loft, where massive picture windows gave her an unobstructed view of the rugged pine ridges. The only part of the house that felt slightly out of place was the basement. The access to the lower level was not a standard indoor staircase. It was an old, heavy wooden root cellar door built into the floorboards of the rear mudroom, secured by a thick, hand-forged iron latch and a sliding steel bolt. Beneath the hatch was a flight of steep, rough-hewn stone steps descending into a cool, earth-walled cellar that housed the home's modern water heater, the well pressure tank, and an older, non-functional coal furnace that had been disconnected decades prior. The floor of the basement was rough, poured concrete, but the back wall of the cellar was entirely natural, composed of the solid, fractured gray limestone that formed the bedrock of the mountain itself. On the evening of Tuesday, September 14th, Claire was sitting in the great room around 9:30 at night. She had a fire going in the stone hearth, her laptop open, and was enjoying a cup of chamomile tea. The autumn weather had turned cold, with temperatures dropping into the low 40s under an ink-black, starless mountain sky. As she worked, the room suddenly felt noticeably colder. A sharp, icy draft drifted across the living room floorboards, chilling her ankles. Claire set her laptop aside, assuming she had left a window cracked in the rear mudroom. She stood up, walked down the narrow central hallway, and stepped into the small utility room near the back door. The back door was shut tight, its deadbolt fully engaged. The double-hung window above the laundry sink was closed and locked. Yet, the room was freezing. Claire looked down at the floor. The icy draft was rising directly through the narrow, quarter-inch seam between the heavy floorboards of the wooden cellar door. And as Claire stood in the silence of the mudroom, listening to the wind sighing outside, she heard a sound rising from the dark space beneath the floorboards. It was not the mechanical hum of the water heater. It was not the clicking of the well pressure switch. It was a faint, steady, rhythmic sound that resembled a human breath being pushed through dry teeth. Inhale, exhale. It was quiet, barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator, but it had a distinct, fluid cadence that sounded unmistakable. Claire knelt down on the cold linoleum, resting her palms against the heavy chestnut wood of the cellar hatch. She leaned her right ear close to the iron pull ring, holding her breath. From the dark, subterranean cold 12 feet below the floor, the sound shifted. It was no longer just breathing. A voice began to murmur. The voice was low, raspy, and layered, sounding like multiple people whispering the exact same words in unison, so faint that the syllables blended into a continuous, dry hiss that echoed off the damp limestone walls below. Claire could not make out individual words, but the tone of the murmuring was conversational, urgent, and seemed to move slowly from the far back corner of the cellar toward the base of the stone steps. Claire pulled her head back instantly, her heart slamming violently against her ribcage. She told herself that it had to be a natural acoustic trick. The mountains were full of limestone caverns. An underground air current passing through a fissure in the foundation wall could easily create a draft that whistled and vibrated against the old furnace pipes, creating sounds that her tired brain was misinterpreting as human speech. She double-checked the heavy sliding bolt on top of the cellar door, ensuring the iron bar was seated firmly in its bracket. She walked back to the living room, turned on every light on the ground floor, locked her bedroom door, and slept with her reading lamp on until the pale morning sun broke through the pines at 6:30. The next morning, Wednesday, September 15th, the bright autumn daylight restored Claire's sense of logic. She decided she was not going to live in fear of her own foundation. She was an adult, a homeowner, and she needed to inspect the cellar thoroughly to find the source of the draft and seal whatever gap was letting cold air in from the mountain bedrock. At 10 in the morning, Claire pulled on a pair of heavy work gloves, grabbed a heavy-duty tactical flashlight with a 3,000 lumen beam, and walked into the mudroom. She slid the heavy iron bolt back, lifted the heavy chestnut hatch, and hooked it to the wall latch. A wave of freezing, damp air surged upward from the opening, carrying a heavy, pungent odor that had not been there during the home inspection. It smelled like wet copper, sulfur, and deep, stagnant swamp water that had never seen sunlight. Claire clicked her flashlight on and walked down the steep, narrow stone steps. The basement was quiet. The concrete floor was dry, and the water heater sat in the center of the room, its small green diagnostic light blinking steadily. Claire walked slowly to the back of the cellar, sweeping her wide beam across the natural limestone wall that formed the rear foundation. That was when she saw the opening. In the far corner, behind the rusted, obsolete casing of the old 1930s coal furnace, a massive slab of limestone had shifted. A natural, vertical fracture in the rock had widened into a dark, jagged crevice nearly 2 feet wide. Plunging horizontally back into the solid heart of the mountain, Claire stepped closer, pointing her searchlight directly into the dark void. The light penetrated about 20 feet into a natural, ancient cave tunnel that sloped downward into the black bedrock. The stone walls of the passage were smooth, slick with moisture, and covered in thin, white mineral veining. And lying on the flat stone floor just inside the opening of the crevice, bathed in the white glare of her flashlight, was an object. It was a small, child-sized wooden rocking horse carved by hand from dark oak, its red paint cracked and peeling with age. Resting neatly across the wooden seat of the toy was a modern plastic ballpoint pen from a local hardware store in Pine Glen, along with a small, folded piece of yellow legal pad paper. Claire's hands began to shake. She did not want to step through the crevice, but the realization that someone had recently been inside the stone tunnel beneath her house made her pulse spike with sheer adrenaline. She leaned forward, reached her gloved arm into the narrow opening, and snatched the folded piece of yellow paper off the wooden toy. She stepped back onto the concrete floor of the cellar, unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, and brought it into the beam of her flashlight. Written on the paper in dark, jagged handwriting that pressed so hard into the page it had torn the fibers was a single, continuous sentence written over and over from the top of the sheet to the bottom. "We hear you walking above us, Claire. We hear you walking above us, Claire. We hear you walking above us, Claire." Claire choked on a gasp, dropping the paper onto the damp floor. She had never given her name to any local neighbors. She had moved in less than a week ago, ordering all her supplies online, and had spoken to no one in the village of Pine Glen. At that exact second, from deep inside the dark, horizontal rock crevice behind the old furnace, the sound started again. It was not a faint whisper this time. From 30 feet back in the black subterranean tunnel came the loud, clear, unmistakable sound of multiple bare feet slapping rapidly against wet stone, moving with terrifying speed up the incline toward the opening of the cellar. And as the footsteps tore through the dark rock passage, a chorus of voices rose from the stone, shouting her name in a frantic, overlapping frenzy that vibrated the concrete floor beneath her boots. "Claire! Claire! Claire! Let us out!" Claire did not look into the crevice. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She pivoted on the concrete floor, dropped the heavy tactical flashlight, and scrambled up the steep stone steps on her hands and knees. Behind her, The chorus of shrieking voices grew deafening, rising into a piercing cacophony that reverberated off the foundation walls. From the dark void behind the furnace came the violent, metallic screech of the rusted iron casing being shoved aside, followed by the wet scraping of elongated limbs clawing onto the cellar floor. Claire burst into the mudroom, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the chestnut hatch, and slammed it down with all her strength. The heavy wooden door crashed into the frame. She threw her entire body weight onto the hatch, jamming the sliding iron bolt into the steel receiver just as something slammed violently against the underside of the wood. Thump! The impact was so immense that it rattled the floorboards across the entire ground floor, lifting the hatch half an inch against the locked bolt. From directly beneath Claire's boots, separated by only 2 inches of solid chestnut timber, came a flurry of furious, frantic pounding. Dozens of small, hard objects like sharp bone or thick claws scratched and gouged against the wood, accompanied by that ragged, collective shriek, "Claire! Open the door! Claire! We are cold!" Claire scrambled backward across the linoleum, tears blinding her vision, her breath coming in ragged, suffocating gasps. She did not stop to grab her coat, her purse, or her art equipment. She snatched her car keys from the hook by the back door, kicked open the exterior entrance, and sprinted down the porch steps into the driveway. She threw herself into her vehicle, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Claire threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires against the gravel as she backed out of the turnaround. As the headlights swept across the front of the Craftsman house, Claire slammed her foot on the brake in sheer, paralyzing horror. Every single window on the ground floor of the house was crowded with silhouettes. They were tall, gaunt figures with impossibly long, spindly necks and pale, hairless heads pressed flat against the glass panes. Their faces were smooth, devoid of features, except for wide, gaping, circular mouths that were vibrating silently behind the glass, fogging the interior surface with thick plumes of condensation. Slowly, dozens of long, jointed gray fingers pressed against the glass, tapping in unison against the window panes with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Claire slammed the transmission into drive and floored the accelerator. The car rocketed down the steep switchbacks of Black Bear Hollow Road, sliding dangerously around the unpaved curves, gravel spraying into the dark tree line as she fled Sproul State Forest. She did not slow down until she reached the bright, fluorescent lights of a 24-hour truck stop along Interstate 80, 30 miles away. Claire never spent another night in the house. The following week, she hired an emergency private moving company and a local real estate attorney to handle the liquidation of the property. When the moving crew arrived with a police escort to retrieve her studio supplies and personal belongings, the lead contractor reported that the interior of the house was completely intact, with one terrifying exception. The heavy chestnut root cellar door in the mudroom had been split straight down the center grain, warped by immense upward pressure, and covered in thousands of deep, parallel scratches that had gouged through 2 inches of solid wood. The estate liquidation firm put the property back on the market at a drastic 60% markdown. It sat empty for 18 months before being quietly purchased by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which promptly condemned the structure. In the summer of 2022, state demolition crews tore down the Craftsman home and poured 30 tons of quick-setting concrete down the cellar steps, permanently sealing the subterranean fissure beneath 20 feet of solid stone. Claire Bennett relocated to coastal Maine, abandoning rural properties entirely for a third-floor apartment in downtown Portland. And whenever she speaks with colleagues who talk about escaping the noise of modern life for a dream home tucked deep into the Appalachian ridges, Claire always gives them the exact same warning. When a house in those ancient mountains is cheap, you do not ask what is wrong with the roof. You ask what is living under the floor. And if the basement ever starts whispering into the dark, you do not investigate, you run.